Hey kids, next month's series on this podcast finally gives you the opportunity to become co-conspirators in the crimes carried out at the Cinemodities restaurant. We are now taking requests for movies, TV shows, visual albums, etc., and this is where we'll choose our episodes for November from. Reach out to us through email, cinemodities@gmail.com, or Twitter, @Cinemodities. We can't wait to hear from you out in listener land. And feel free to send in snack ideas with your requests.
Are you ready?
Are you prepared to be scared?
I'm prepped.
We're about to put the monster in Monstober.
And it's gonna get spooky.
Now!
The following film contains some scenes that may be frightening for some viewers. Watch out for boos and bangs and oh my gosh, I didn't see that coming moments. Because they're in there. Parental guidance is recommended.
Late Night Movies with Rob and Zach. This is a podcast about cinematic oddities where we discuss any media that is too bizarre, abnormal, or off-kilter for contemporary audiences. Occasionally these projects gel, most times they crash hard into the realm of obscurity. Join us as we delve into the cult classic swamp. I'm Zach.
And I'm Rob, the little person who lives inside Zach's mouth. This week we are continuing on with the third, true official episode of our Monstober series. Not counting the bastard child of Goosebumps. And, Zach and I, we sat down and we said, what should we do for this third spot in Monstober? Since Zach has his fourth spot going through so many iterations I don't get to touch, he kind of came to me and asked me for some thoughts on what we should do this week. And we both kind of agreed and said, man, we should really discuss something that doesn't have a lot of analysis behind it. We want to touch on something that no one else has really discussed ever and give our own fresh thoughts on it. And that's why this week we're discussing the 2002 Ted Bundy film by Matthew Bright. Is that correct, Zach?
Yes, we are delving into, again, after 3.5 hours, we figured you didn't get enough Ted Bundy. So we're going to discuss it in reverse this time. We watched the movie again, backwards, overlaid with the film playing in its normal speed. So get ready, folks. We're going to do a live commentary of the Ted Bundy film backwards, overlaid with the film playing normally.
That's
how I imagine it sounds backwards. It sounds like a cat dying.
Fantastic. So with that out of the way, of course, by the episode title that we think everybody reads before they click on these. I think that'd be cool if people are just listening to our podcast without, looking at the title first. But we are discussing not only the classic 1980 Kubrick film, The Shining, but also Room 237 to some extent. And I think this is really where I want to throw it over to Zach, because as the joke I made just a few minutes ago, we're doing something that nobody has ever talked about. What are we going to do this episode? How are we not just going to repeat everything that's ever been said about The Shining before? What were your thoughts on that, Zach? Why did this get a spot in Monstober?
Well, much like how Rob was talking about last week, how Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 was a spot that was in Monstober the longest. It wasn't. It was The Shining. The Shining's one of those movies that I've always loved talking about. And because most people just think of it as, here's Johnny.
Yeah,
that's it. That's the discourse for The Shining for most people. It begins
that and Red Rum, I would say. I remember when I was a little kid, my parents would say Red Rum a bunch. That stuck with them for some reason. It took me years to actually see this movie and read the book by Stephen King to know where it was from.
Yeah, that's pretty much it's one of those movies that for mainstream audiences, it's rather just at the surface. It's a very superficial film. It's just weird and kooky extreme things happen at a hotel. Cabin fever, ghost, here's Johnny.
Yep, no beer, no TV, make Homer go crazy.
Oh, that's such a great episode. That's such a great episode. Remember, folks, we can't say the word. We have to call it the shinning because...
Don't want to get sued.
Hey, I found a shortcut through a hedge maze.
Why, you little? No, go easy on the wee one. His father's gonna go crazy and chop 'em all into haggis.
What's haggis?
Boy, you read my thoughts. You've got the shinning.
You mean shining.
Shh, you wanna get sued?
But yes, so that's why I fear, even though like The Shining's been done to death, like every other episode of Cinemodities, we talk about how like, oh, there's some things that have like no like any sort of commentary about them on the internet, whether it be like wonder shows in the Ted Bundy movie. Like Rob has said numerous times now, there is no short of opinions on this film.
None in the slightest, as is shown by the pairing documentary that we watched with this.
Yes, Room 237, for those of you who don't know, isn't just a fictional room in this film. It's also a documentary by filmmaker Rodney Asher about psychotic fan theories about The Shining.
Yeah, yep. I'm glad we paired that with this one. I'd only seen Room 237 once. I'm glad I got to watch it again to remind myself of a lot of it because only certain parts had stuck with me. The Shining is a different boat. I think I see The Shining at least once a year. I think Zach and I have only ever maybe tangentially talked about it. The Shining, it isn't one of like my favorite movies, but when I'm not watching it, but when I am watching it, I'm totally engrossed by it. Like it's this weird thing where it's like I have to get over the hill of starting to watch it, and once I do, I'm just in for the ride every single time.
It's one of those films that I'd be hard pressed to say that it's one of my favorite films. I'd say it's definitely one of those films that I admire very much. And again, it's one of those things where it's like just because I don't want to say it's in the same camp as Eraserhead, not at least in the conventional sense is how I usually use that like connotation. Sure. But I put it in there as like, okay, I would never say like, oh, you know what? I'm going to put The Shining on for a fun little romp for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, yes.
It's like, no. This is a film that you watch for a very specific reason. I don't think it's just one of those films you just throw on a Sunday afternoon to kill the time. Mm-hmm. Much like Rob said, I think it's a very hypnotic film. It's one of those movies, much like any other Kubrick film, that you put it on, you really can't kind of help but watch the rest of it once you get kind of like pulled enough into it.
Yeah, and I kind of fell into that exact trap because I watched The Shining last night before today's recording. And, you know, as I do, I usually set myself up to take some notes. And I fell into the trap of just being enthralled by the movie and not taking very many notes. But thankfully, I've seen this so many times, I don't think I need to take notes.
Yeah, because we'll get into context in a minute.
I do want to say, because, you know, in the day and age we live in, trigger warning, there's an N-word in this movie.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that.
Me too. Literally, my note at that point in the movie is all caps N-word alert. Because it took me by complete surprise. It was just kind of just dropped so nonchalantly, and I was like, "Whoa, did that just happen?"
But no, this is The Shining is such. It's one of those movies, and I don't think we've ever, again, the joke on Cinemodities is that we've already talked about Animal Collective 800 times, Hack Snyder. God, we've discussed Hack Snyder more times between this and the Star Wars podcast. And it's like, this is the first time we've ever discussed a Stanley Kubrick film.
Yep, absolutely.
And the thing about Stanley Kubrick is that to say his films are layered are an understatement. But at the same time, when you watch The Shining, you almost don't want to pick through it.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the. I can't believe I thought we were going to come at different sides from this, but that's one of the things why I think I've said this to Zach before, but in only very briefly. The Room 237 documentary, I love the concept. I hate the content. Like and this might sound really weird to Zach because Zach knows me, and they even mention it at the end of Room 237. Someone says, "Why did Kubrick make this movie so complicated?" And another person says, "Well, why did Joyce write Finnegan's Wake?" The Finnegan's Wake is something that deserves to be picked apart because there are so many layers, and you can't just read that at a surface level. The Shining is something that allows itself with both. You can pick through it in detail and analyze as much as you want, but at the same time, you can just sit back for 2.5 hours and watch it. And that's where I'm kind of torn, where it's like, I love some of the ideas, the concept, like I said, of Room 237, but you don't give me 30 minutes about moon landing conspiracies. Don't give me, oh yeah, I just thought it'd be fun, and then I just spent 60 years of my life drawing maps of this movie. And it's like, I appreciate it. I've been there. I've wasted my time on detailing things like this. But I don't know. For some reason, with The Shining, I'm just against it. Like, I think the best way to summarize this is there's a clip in Room 237 when the moon landing conspiracy stuff is the front piece. That's the section of the movie where it's one guy talking about all his moon landing conspiracies. And he talks about the shot of the room number 237 key. And
Moon
he says,
room. Moon
yes,
room.
but here's the thing. I've thought this the first time I saw the movie and the second time I saw the movie. I'm so glad I get to say this on something recorded because it's my true opinion. The actual scene, of course, we'll put the clip in, plays out with the guy saying, of all the capital letters on this key, you can only spell 2 words, moon and room. And my first response is, you can also spell moron.
And on the key is the words room and then the word NO, which is an old acronym for number. So room number 237, except that the only capital letters on the key are ROOM and then the N from the acronym NO. And if there's only 2 words that you can come up with that have those letters in them, and that's moon and room. And so on the key, the tag, it says moon room, and that is the moon room. This is where everything happens, and none of it's real, and it all has to be lied about.
That's how I feel. Like, I love conspiracy theories. Zach knows me. I'll dig deep into crazy nonsense with the best of them. But you cannot be that short-sighted in your conspiracy. And that's what I feel this movie, Room 237, comes off as, and why I'm so against a lot of this deep analytical discussion of The Shining, at least in the way they present it, because it's like you're clearly leaving things out. You're seeing things because you want to see them. At least that's what the sense I get from the people they interview in that film.
Well, okay, because this is going to be a weird conversation, folks, because I think we're assuming that everybody listening to this episode has seen The Shining at some point.
Yeah, I was about to say something similar, that, this is definitely...
We're assuming you've seen this. We're not going to break this down.
Yeah, this is not going to be a breakdown. I think there's only really one scene I want to dive into to a great extent, and it's near the end of the film.
Bear costume blowjob.
Oh, well, that, I figured you'd get into that. I want to get into the freezer door opening scene.
Well, okay, we'll get to that. To answer, or I don't think Rob was asking a question, but to kind of respond to his statement, is that I've been hooked on Room 237, the documentary, since the spring of 2013, and over time I've always been fascinated by this documentary. I love, as I become more of a mature film or cinephile, I've come to appreciate like behind the scenes discussions more than like the actual film itself. Like I can, like, when it comes to like the makings of things like Alien, Jaws, any of these movies that kind of had like, I don't want to say horrible productions, I think that is the more interesting story than the final film. Sure. Like I've watched the behind the scenes documentary on Alien more than the film Alien itself. And I think Room 237 does a very specific job in that we're never going to get that behind the scenes documentary on The Shining because most of Stanley Kubrick never let anybody in to do stuff like that. The Shining's actually one of the very few instances where he did, because I know one of his daughters had like a camera and was filming like a lot of B-roll on the set, and it's on the Blu-ray and DVD, but it's only like 20 minutes worth. It's like a criminally short amount of content, considering that she was there for like a nice portion of the shoot. But Kubrick didn't really let anybody into his creative process in the sense of, and plus this was during the time of the 80s where people didn't shoot B-roll as much as they like back in like the 90s and 2000s era. Never mind now.
Yeah.
And even now they don't shoot a lot of B-roll now because they don't want any of their dirty little secrets getting out there with things like your major like Marvel films, your I don't mean Marvel, I mean your superhero stuff. They don't want any of how the sausage is made getting into the ether of pop culture. But no, I think Room 237 does an important job, and I don't see the film as like 'cause I like I've said numerous times, I always try to go find like a podcast in the projection booth. Did an episode on The Shining and Room 237.
Okay.
And they're kind of doing what hopefully we're going to do here. They focused on The Shining through the lens of 237. And the thing is that one of the guys talking in that episode was like, when I first watched Room 237, I was very frustrated by like all the nonsense that it presents. And then he goes, over the years, as I've watched this, I've seen that wasn't what the director of the film, Rodney Asher, was trying to do. He wasn't trying to make a film be understanding The Shining. He was making a film. They even said, how do you even classify this? It's not a documentary. It's not a scripted story. It's really its own weird sort of like space as a genre all to itself.
Yeah, I consider it, especially on this last viewing, it's almost like, you know, a classier and more mature version of a listicle. Because I'm sure this exists where it's like, you know, boiling down. Kubrick did a lot of research into Colorado and took all these things and boiled them down to their narrowest elements. And it's like, yeah, the movie spends half an hour on it, but somebody probably has written that in a BuzzFeed article in 3 sentences.
Yeah, but I think what this film is ultimately trying to get at is that it's more of an expose on the inner workings of fanaticism in film criticism.
Yeah, and I think that's where why I say more. I love the concept rather than the content, because even the first time I saw it, I remember telling Zach, I think we were at dinner with my parents and Boompa, and for some reason this kind of came up, and I love the way this movie starts, where the guy's like, the European poster had the wave of terror that swept across America now comes to Europe. And it's like, oh, well, do you think that's the movie? That's the book? No, it's the plight of the Native Americans. And I'm like, that's great. That's weird enough to start this movie. But then it goes on into, well, this is why I know about Native Americans. And Dr. Dolittle from the 60s was pathetic. And I'm like, what? We don't need this in this documentary. This is just him ranting, it seems.
But I think that's what he's trying to have, though. I think it's supposed to be, it's like a stream. Again, this really is kind of like a new age experimental type of filmmaking, because it's commentary narration over, oh God, I don't want to see B-roll, but it's other footage of other things that are kind of like melded into the context of the narration / commentary. And I do think when you look at it as a complete package, not just picking out the commentary of one of the 5 people and what they're trying to get at, I do think this thing works. I think there really is nothing quite like it, and especially it's done on this. It's also focused on a topic that most film goers, even casual ones, can appreciate, because mostly everybody's seen The Shining at some point in their lives.
Absolutely.
Like if you did. It's like if you were to do this on the cinematic equivalent of like a Finnegan's Wake. Like if you were to do this exact same film about Eraserhead, it would be very dense, and you'd have a hard time getting people on board with it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But if you do it with The Shining, a film that, like you said earlier, it works on a very superficial level, and it works the deeper and deeper you dig into it. And I think that's kind of the brilliance of picking The Shining as a focal point for this sort of, I don't even want to call it filmmaking, but for this sort of project.
Okay.
And that's how like I said, we'll get back to The Shining, folks. It's not just going to be simply philosophical dissection of what kind of creative thing Room 237 is. Mm-hmm. But I think overall, the more and more I watch this, the more and more appreciate it on different levels. Because, and also too, think about how crazy some of these theories are that these people say. And yet between the narration commentary, that's very stream of consciousness, the visuals also help convey the story to that by the end, you pretty much understand everything that has been told to you in the last 90 minutes.
Oh, yeah. It does a good job in that aspect. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's very fluid. It's very easy. I don't want to say it's very digestible, because I do think you have to be paying attention. This is not like one of those things you put on at like a house party and everybody goes to different corners of the room. It's not that. It's not. What'd you call it back during the 18s? What was it? A party core?
Partycore, yep.
Yeah, it's not partycore cinema. This isn't the Avengers Endgame where you can just put it on the TV and people will show up when there's an action sequence.
Yeah, neither is Amazon Women on the Moon. Someone screamed at me when I tried that. I can't. I'm just thinking now, the same person, would they scream about this in the same way they screamed about Arsenio Hall?
I can only hope. All right, context time.
Oh, yeah.
context time. So, okay, I'm going to let Rob go first because I would imagine Rob's context is going to be just a tad shorter than mine is when it comes to this.
Definitely. I don't even think I know Zach's whole history with The Shining. The thing I think I want to highlight first off is that this isn't something I think Zach and I discussed to any great extent back when we were really, getting to know each other, getting into movies. I have no recollection of me and you ever watching this together, watching parts of it. It's really only been since this podcast that I think Kubrick and The Shining has come up to a greater extent. I think that's because of it took me a really long time to see 2001: A Space Odyssey. I didn't see that till I was in college. Like, I never saw that when I was younger. And that's when I started to have a mature mind to be able to say, oh, Zach, like, this was great. Like, this movie worked for me on so many levels. And The Shining I definitely saw when I was younger because I was so into Stephen King. And I think we've said it on this podcast before that when I was younger, I would read through Stephen King books. Of course, I was always a bigger fan of the Richard Bachman books than the Stephen King books. We're going to get to Thinner one day. Thinner's a great movie because it turns into like a crime mob movie at a certain point with gypsies. Anyway, so I was into Stephen King. The Shining was one of the ones I didn't read till a little later on. And right around the time I was kind of working through Stephen King, that's when I was starting to be like, okay, let's see the movies. Let's see the film adaptations or the TV miniseries. I'm thinking of like The Stand and stuff like that. And The Shining was one that I definitely noticeably picked up on the differences between the book and the movie, as Room 237 gets into, and I'm sure I'll get into a little bit more. But I kind of liked both. I was on the fence. I didn't really know what to think about either at the time, but I felt that I enjoyed them. And as time went on, The Shining just kind of fell by the wayside for me. And it really wasn't until I started getting into other Kubrick movies. Like in my sophomore year of college, my roommates and I watched 2001: A Space Odyssey. For the first time I had seen it, I loved it. I showed my girlfriend at the time A Clockwork Orange, and that's, another one of my favorite movies and favorite books. Although, not Stephen King. So this, I think this whole thing kind of, has just been forming itself where when I moved away from New York and I moved away from Zach and movies were still in my head and I never really met anybody who could, parallel to Zach on discussion of things in a good way. And it really took that time for me to realize what I was missing to get back into this mature filmmaking and stuff and to actually have a good discussion about it. And that's why only in like the last few years I say I watch The Shining, once every year because it sticks with me so much now. Hell, I watch 2001: A Space Odyssey even more often. The opening scene, the dawn of man or the birth of man, that's great. I'm always going to love that when a monkey figures out they can hurt another monkey. That is the birth of man. And so, yeah, I think that's my context, where this was just something that just touched upon slightly throughout my life. And now that Zach is kind of, training me or pushing me to a more analytical mindset with some of this stuff, I really appreciate it in a lot better sense. So
Cool.
Thank you, Zach.
You're welcome, Rob. Anytime he says the way I moved away from Zach, I want you to replace the words moved away with ran away. Come on, he's sugarcoating it, folks.
Hey,
Never heard the
okay,
word
Zach,
moved,
the
it's ran.
first two moves were not into different time zones, okay? But then I made up with it because the third move was 2 time zones away.
Exactly. See? It was subconscious, folks. He knew what he was doing all along.
I think I do want to add to my context that ever since in these last few years, and I think this is important to this discussion and what I said about discussing it with you, a lot of the people I know out here in Colorado, when I talk to them, like, we'll hang out every weekend, every other weekend, we'll see each other at work, in the middle of the week. It'll be like, oh, how's it going? And I'll usually say, like, oh, I watched The Shining. Like, that's what I did this past weekend. It was just, the time was right. So many people I talk to out here are like, I've never seen it. And the people that have seen it are kind of like, yeah, I didn't think it was that scary. And I'm like, I don't want to talk to you about this now. Because it's not about if it's scary or not. And I think that's a question I want to pose for Zach, which he could answer before or after his context. I don't think of this as a horror movie, but it seems like that's the way people do think of it. It's a Monstober movie, don't get me wrong, but nothing about this really scares me or I feel should scare anybody. But that, of course, that's just my feelings towards it.
Okay.
But that shouldn't frame them. Like, no one should watch this movie and go, I wasn't scared, so it was stupid.
Well, okay, people, especially when it comes to, okay, there's this thing that happens with horror movies, is that a good horror movie is never called a horror movie. It's called a thriller or something like that. It's like the Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs is a goddamn horror movie. I don't care what you say. But the problem is that people who are in prestige or in the put themselves on a pedestal can't say they like horror movies, because horror movies means just crap. Most of what horror is crap. So when you do get a gem, you can't call it that. It's kind of like what happened with Silence of the Lambs, Get Out, is that anytime you have something worth talking about, they have to elevate it so they don't seem like they're getting into the mud with everybody else.
Okay.
And that's one of those things where a lot of people who love horror movies don't like that about this Hollywood and just entertainment and film criticism. But that's something that you're never going to change. The people in power always get to figure out a way to put themselves on a higher plateau than the rest of us.
Sure.
That's a conversation for another day. But no, that's how I see it though. When it comes to people in The Shining, I don't know. I definitely say based on the Stephen King renaissance of adaptations that we're currently in, I would say that most people are on board with The Shining. It shows up a lot on cable this time of the year. I'd say at least in October, it shows up probably once a weekend on AMC or one of your channels like that. Again, and folks, we didn't do this on, I think we might have, I might have done it on purpose, was that there is Dr. Sleep coming out in a couple of weeks by the time you're hearing this. And we'll touch upon that later in the episode if we remember to do so. Because there's a whole other can of worms there to open up if we have any time.
I feel like when you say if we remember, it's going to be one of those situations where it's like, everybody wants to forget, but then that one kid's like, you didn't assign homework tonight. And it's like, oh, fuck. Because I don't want to think about that movie anymore.
Well, oh, God, we have to get, okay. Once we talk about the movie more, we'll get into that. Because there's some things that need to be explained about how The Shining kind of exists that before you can delve into why Dr. Sleep I have issues with it, or why Rob has some issues with it too. But no, my context to The Shining, I've always, ever since, I think I talked about it last week with the AFI 100 Years, 100 Thrills with the Dennis Hopper Blue Velvet. When that aired in the summer of 2001, that really did introduce me to a ton of movies. And I'm pretty sure that's how I got introduced to The Shining. Again, like I said, it was 100 movies, so a lot got thrown at me all at once. But that's, I think, how I got introduced to The Shining, A Clockwork Orange. I'm not sure. 2001 might have been on there. I'm not certain. Yeah, 2001 definitely was on that list. And that's how I was introduced to it. So I always knew about Stanley Kubrick. I was always aware of him as a filmmaker. And I think the next instance where I really I think the first Kubrick movie, I always tried when I was in middle school to watch 2001. Plus, my father always raved about it because he was part of that generation where that was truly a mind-blowing thing. That was kind of like, I think any true student of film will understand the phrase 2001 was a life-altering experience. You're not a true cinephile unless you've had that experience with 2001. But no, it's like I always tried watching 2001, could never really get past the first 40, 45 minutes because it's science fiction with a capital SF. It's not Star Wars. It's not space fantasy. But no, so I tried watching that. And really the first Kubrick film I ever saw was A Clockwork Orange. And that was in the same kind of corridor as when I talked about Wonder Shows and where I was really I was latching onto any sort of media. And for the longest time, and even to this day, I haven't watched A Clockwork Orange probably in at least 10 years. I would say for the longest time that Clockwork Orange was my favorite film of all time that didn't have the word Star Wars in the title or Titanic. I've always had a partition. I have my favorite films that I'm not afraid to talk about and the ones that I really don't want to explain to people why I like them. And Titanic is on the list where I really don't want to explain to people why I like that film. But no, so I've always my reverence for A Clockwork Orange was always high. And then it wasn't until the fall of 2009, as if Rob can remember, when I got my projector for Halloween and I was looking for horror movie clips to play on the side of my house, that I went on to eBay, and for a couple of bucks, I got a bunch of horror movies, again, like your Silence of the Lambs, your Nightmare Before Christmas, even though that's not really a horror movie, Hannibal, and one of them was The Shining. I'd really never seen The Shining in any capacity. And to the point where, if Rob remembers, during Web Soup, Web Soup used to have a segment called WTF, and the segment like clip that introduced the main thing from the internet was a reenactment of the bear costume blowjob scene.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. It's all coming back to me now. When you first said Web Soup, I was like, I'm only going to get these memories if you know the number to heaven. But you described it enough that I know what you mean. Yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, that was their intro for the WTF segment, was like a recreation of the bear costume blowjob. And it's funny, for the longest, I got a few, because I think Web Soup started in 2009, but for a few months, I had no idea that was from The Shining. So I again, like everybody else, I always knew The Shining as "Here's Johnny," and then Shelley Duvall screaming. And so I watched it, and I think I fell asleep through it. And I didn't really have a high opinion of it. I didn't put that much thought to it. And it wasn't until college, and unlike Rob, I didn't really have a group of people to show movies to. I was always, like I've said before, like when it came to Star Wars, I was always the movie person. I never had a movie peer in college. In high school, Rob was the closest thing I had to that. But so in college, I really kind of I don't want to say I got into Kubrick, but he really kind of was my bread and butter. In a way, I never even realized it, more subconsciously than consciously, because when I was in my film studies program, I would go up to the cinema professor, and it was my first class with her where it was more of a class as opposed to a lecture hall. And it was a course called Significant Cinema Directors, and we had like a list of directors we could do. It was your John Ford, it was your Hitchcock. It was a couple other more you're really, you think of, oh God, there's a couple other ones that are on the tip of my tongue that I can't think of right now. Oh God, what was his name? Ford. Oh yeah, I already said John Ford. Oh God, oh my God, I can think of it. The guy who directed The First Thing. Okay,
Carpenter. Oh, the First Thing.
Oh God, it's
like
gonna
from
drive
way back in the day.
God, it's gonna drive me nuts. I have to look it up, folks. I'm sorry.
You're not talking about John Carpenter.
No. Rob hates it when I say I have to say that we're looking something up. No,
I don't know who directed The First Thing.
Oh my God, where is it? Oh my God, where is it? I'm gonna know the name as soon as I see it. As soon as I see it, I'm gonna know the name.
Christian Nibby?
Howard Hawks.
Hawks. Okay.
Howard Hawks. There you go. Okay, folks, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So it was during that we'd like pick from a handful of directors, and I went up to the cinema professor. This is before I knew her well, and I'm like, "Can I do Kubrick?" And I guess I had talked to her enough at that point. She's like, "I know you really like Kubrick though, but like I prefer you do something on the list." But I'm like, "Kubrick," and she actually yelled at me. She's like, "No." I'm like, "Okay then." I actually got shouted down by a teacher. Anyway, though, no, she was really cool. And to this day, I thank her for everything. She gave me, her and her husband gave me a Laserdisc player, so they love me. To this, hopefully, they still love me. Nice. But anyway, though, so like, no, I always thought about Kubrick, and he was always, he was kind of like, my obsession with him kind of came in the wake of David Lynch, to the point where I guess I kind of inadvertently and subconsciously latched onto him. That being Kubrick, because Lynch was still weird. Like Lynch, I still haven't seen much. Like I still have never seen Wild at Heart. I've never watched All Fire Walk with Me. There's still a lot of Lynch that even I'm not prepared for mentally.
I love Wild at Heart.
I bet you do, Rob. I bet you do. And we're going to talk soon about the fact that there's apparently rumors that there's going to be a Twin Peaks season 4. Which, heaven, please don't let there be a season 4. Season 3 ended so perfectly. Don't ruin it.
It really was. The only way I would want a season 4 if the entirety of season 4 is even less sexier sex scenes than episode 18 of season 3.
But no, so like to the point where, and then going forward in my college career, where there was it was an internship in kind name only, where I think I've told Rob the story where I was like a glorified TA for a semester for the male professor, and it was me and this other guy whose name was Yun Fan, and I absolutely hated him because he was the most obnoxious person on the face of this earth that thought he was smarter than everybody. And I had to interact with him so much. He never did any work. He'd encourage kids to cheat on exams. He was the worst. And yet they always held him in higher esteem than me, and I could never figure it out. But anyway, though, that's a topic for another day. And so toward like the final like month of the semester, the male cinema professor came up to us and he's like, guys, how would you like to do, like, for one class, like, I'll scrap whatever it is I'm supposed to be talking about, and you each can pick your own movie, and you can talk about it in front of the class as long as it's not like one of the genres we've already covered in the semester so far.
That's
and I'm
teacher
like,
speak for, I'm going to be hungover that day, so can my TA do the work?
whatever it was, I was thrilled because I was really hoping, like, when this thing first started, I was really hoping for that. And I originally wanted to do Drive, Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive, but we already done like noir, so I was told no, I couldn't do that. But I figured the next best thing was horror because like both the cinema professors always hated horror films. They always considered it like a subpar genre for the aforementioned reasons. And so I figured, okay, and at that point too, I was kind of getting like snobby. So like, okay, I'm not going to do like Jason Goes to Hell. Like now, if I was there, I'd be doing Jason Goes to Hell and explaining why that is a masterpiece.
Sure.
So I had to do something a little bit more highbrow. So I figured, oh, The Shining would be perfect. And right around this time, I discovered Room 237. I think it just showed up on video on demand within like a couple of weeks of this all happening. And when I watched that, I never knew how just zany and bonkers The Shining was on a subliminal level. Mm-hmm. So I did my presentation, and I actually recorded it, or I did like a PowerPoint, and it's on YouTube still. People can go find it. Unlike the Tumblr articles, Rob wasn't forced to go read this one, or I'm sorry, watch this one. But no, I was really proud of it. It was really fun doing like a 15-minute long presentation about The Shining, about all the weird like eccentricities in it. And the thing that pissed me off was that Yun Fan. He sat there like he never prepared for anything. And so he did the Audrey Hepburn, or is it Audrey or Catherine? Sabrina. This was with Humphrey Bogart. Okay. He did that. And how this cinema professor's class would work was he would talk about the movie because it was always a 3-hour long lecture once a week. Mm-hmm. It was the first like 15, 20 minutes of the class were the lecture. And then there's like a 10-minute bathroom break. Then the rest of the period was the movie.
Oh, right.
And then like the week before, I'm like, oh, like, is there a chance that like one of us can show our movie? And he's like, well, you can't do yours because yours is like 2.5 hours long. And I'm like, fine. If I knew like I had an option of picking something I could actually show the entire movie for, I would have picked something different and something a lot weirder. I would have done Eraserhead if I could have gotten away with it. Remember, folks, that's always the holy grail. That would have been the perfect late night movie. It's like 7:00 on a Wednesday, and you have like a captive audience of like 100+ people, and you like that is the ultimate goal of a Cinemodity late night movie right there.
I trust you'll do the right thing, Henry, and show Eraserhead.
Oh, folks, that would have been a dream come true. That would have been an absolute dream come true. Holding like a lecture hall of 100+ people hostage while Eraserhead plays. Oh, that'd be great. Oh God, oh my God. I am going to fantasize about that tonight.
That's Zach's version of a late night movie. He doesn't want one person in his clutches. He wants a lecture hall in his clutches.
There were actually, now that you mention it, okay. Tangential rant that actually is applicable to this, because it is noted that in the history for The Shining that Stanley Kubrick loved Eraserhead, that he would screen this film for the cast and crew on the set to say this is the sort of ambiance I want for this movie. Nice. So we are allowed to talk about Eraserhead in the context of this movie. So it's allowed. This isn't just like a tangent about like nothing. But going back to cinema classes, I remember the female professor, she taught like intro, like independent cinema, and a couple other like the higher ranked ones, or whatever it was, for upperclassmen. And in the independent class, that was a class designed for freshmen. And one of the clips she showed was from Eraserhead. And I asked her, and I said, why don't you show the whole thing? And she's like, I'll disturb the students. They will be disturbed. And I'm like, and I'm pretty sure my exact response to that was, it's like, no, that is the point. You have people in your clutches. You have to make them watch Eraserhead. Like the entire semester should be watching Eraserhead every week.
Yes.
That's the only proper way to teach film, folks. Just keep watching Eraserhead. It's kind of like Orson Welles with like Stagecoach. Just watch Eraserhead over and over again. You'll learn something new every single time.
Indeed.
But no, so Yun Fan got, whoever it was, I found out like that afternoon that like, oh, Yun Fan gets to show all of Sabrina to the class. And I'm like, nobody cares about Sabrina. And I was mad. Like, I was livid. Like, I walked out for like an hour and I'm like, I'm not going to sit there and watch this movie. Sabrina's not a very interesting movie. It's kind of bland. I get why, like, when you're teaching film, why it's kind of important, but it doesn't serve any purpose. It feels like a waste of time. Like, compared to like what you could there's more to be learned from The Shining than there is from Sabrina. I'm like, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen Sabrina, but of course I know of it, and I would agree with you that The Shining has more of an impact, in at least to our lives, than at this day and age than Sabrina does. But I also want to say Yun Fan. That's his name, right? Yun Fan?
Yes.
Fuck you. Fuck you, Yun Fan. I don't even know you, but fuck you. Zach's story made me hate you too.
You know what the best part was? Because every like Monday, him and I were forced to go to the library and offer extra help for a film class.
Yeah.
And once my roommate of many years, Justin, showed up just to see, because I used to complain about this guy all the time. So he wanted to meet him. And while he was sitting there talking to him, he texted me while I'm talking to Yun Fan and said, "What a tard."
Nobody likes you, Yun Fan. Nobody likes you.
No.
Stop listening to this podcast.
Last thing I heard about Yun Fan was that, because he was obviously Chinese, was that he like left the country, and whoever it was, he like left the country and something happened, and he started like mouthing off about like government officials, and he couldn't get back into the U.S. That's a thing that happened apparently. I heard that's the last I ever heard about him. I've never heard anything about him ever since then.
Yun Fan, karma's a bitch.
Yeah, he was obnoxious and I hated him. So I've always been fascinated with The Shining. And even like when I gave this presentation, like my centerpiece was, a lot of it was like pulled from Room 237. And I went through a bunch of things like the TV, like just being able to play without an electrical cord, the ball, the luggage outside the VW Beetle.
Sure.
All that sort of stuff. And the best part was, I think a lot of people liked it, because like throughout the entire presentation, I played the soundtrack to The Shining. So it really put, especially like, Rob remembers the lecture halls in Albany, like they were big. And so you had the whole music playing while I was talking. I think I did a really good job. And so the best part was that, like, after like my presentation ended, like during the bathroom breaks, a couple of kids came up to me like, "Oh, I love The Shining." And the best thing was, in Rob being the educator here, not me, so one kid came up to me after my presentation and said, "Yo, have you seen that documentary Room 237? And I kind of like, if anybody knows their internet memes, there's the internet meme of the black guy with his head like cocked to the side with the question marks above his head.
Yeah.
Like, and that's exactly what I did. Cause I'm like, did you like, you obviously
have you seen Room 237?
Well, it's like, clearly you heard what I just said for the last 20 minutes, because you wouldn't be coming up here if you didn't. But at the same time, though, the entire thesis of my talk was about the Room 237.
Yeah.
So like, I'm like, what? I'm like, it's like, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but next time just try to pay attention.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. You hit one of my teaching mottos right on the head there, Zach.
It was like, I appreciate you coming up and talking to me. I think that's cool, but try to pay attention.
Yeah, for me, it usually comes across as, "I'm glad you're asking a question, but I've already answered it." Type of thing, you know? It's like when someone's like, "Oh, I didn't get this thing," and it's like, yeah, okay, I only repeated that 4 or 5 times, but I'm glad you care enough to ask again.
Yeah, it was one of those where it's like, again, it's just one of those small amusing moments. So like when Rob talks about his educator experience, I'm like, okay, I was there for 1 semester. I know what it feels like. So that's kind of my context for The Shining. Was that I've always known about Room 237. I think it was last year, I finally picked up the Blu-ray. The Blu-ray has all sorts of like bonus features and stuff that like, I think it would drive Rob even further insane. Okay. But yeah, that's kind of the lens we'll be looking at, because there is a lot of stuff going into The Shining. I think for the first time in preparation for this episode, I finally have a slight grasp on what I think The Shining is as a movie, which I've never been able to say prior to this. But yeah, The Shining is one of those movies that it's a movie like, okay, context time for The Shining movie, not Rob and Zach context time, was that going into The Shining, Stanley Kubrick had just directed Barry Lyndon.
Yes.
And if you've never seen Barry Lyndon, it's an incredibly well-made film, but it is the driest thing on the face of this earth.
Okay, yeah, I've never seen it. I just know about it from what I've read and the little bit they talk about in Room 237.
Yeah, Barry Lyndon's great. I have it. I've only watched it once.
Okay.
It's one of those movies I probably should watch again because it is. It's oh god, it's perfect. It's made. It's immaculately crafted, but it's just so dry.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing was, like, that movie didn't make a lot of money at the box office, and Kubrick felt much like this was kind of a very specific time also in Kubrick's like history where it was taking him a while to get movies made. And it wasn't because he couldn't do it. It's just because like he was so prone to like everything had to be perfect.
Yep.
Every detail had to be just exactly how he imagined it. And if it wasn't, everything just came to a grinding halt.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, like, okay, you look at like, oh God, 2001 comes out, 1968, 1971's A Clockwork Orange, 1976 is Barry Lyndon, and then it's like 1980 is The Shining, 87 is Full Metal Jacket, and then we don't get Eyes Wide Shut until 99.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what it was that Kubrick felt that he was kind of being outdone by other filmmakers at the time and really wanted to show like, okay, I am better than all of you. I want to blow. And that's what a lot of the people who knew him at the time, that was his motto going into The Shining was, I want to beat everybody at their own game. Because by the time he was making The Shining, you did have things like your Carries. You had your Halloweens. And this is before like your Nightmare on Elm Streets and Friday the 13th. And even though I don't think Kubrick would have been too concerned with the slasher genre, but you did have more of your horror was going through a revival at this time.
Yeah.
And he wanted to make a film that would kind of just blow everybody out of the water. And that's what he set about doing. And I think and this is one of the things I was thinking about going into this was because I think, context a little bit more was that Stephen King hates this movie.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's no secret that King goes out of his way to just complain and bitch about this movie every single chance he gets. Like, Stephen King, you have all the money in the world, all the acclaim any human being can ever wish to have, and yet if you mention Stanley Kubrick to Stephen King, he will just go off on a rant. And I find that fascinating because clearly there must have been a point in this because The Shining, the book came out, I think, in 1977, right?
Yeah, I think it was late 70s. Yep.
Yeah, 77. And then you sit there, you look at like, because again, Carrie came out, the movie was in 1976. And I think when did Carrie get written? 74?
Yeah, early 70s. I think that was the previous, if not the directly previous book, definitely earlier that decade.
Yeah, okay. Because that's the weird thing is that like Stephen King in the 70s, because the Shining movie didn't come out until 1980. So they probably started filming probably in 78 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And so Stephen King, even though he was like becoming a popular writer, he wasn't Stephen King of today, where you say his name and he's a household just figure. And it's like, I can imagine very easily Stephen King goes into this being like, oh, Carrie was a great success. Can't wait for my other film. And Stanley Kubrick essentially tells him to shut up and sit in the corner.
Yeah. Yep.
And I'm starting to think that's why Stephen King hates this movie. I don't doubt that he probably doesn't like the final product. I don't doubt that for a second. But I think most of his frustration and hostility stems from probably Kubrick telling him, I don't care what you think.
Okay. I could see that.
Stephen King is so successful, yet as of like a year ago, he was still bitching about this. And I would imagine that when Dr. Sleep comes out in a couple of weeks, he will be on some talk show, whether it be Kimmel, Colbert, one of them, and someone will ask him about Stanley Kubrick, and he will roll his eyes.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that.
It'll be like Stephen King. The man's been dead for 20 years. Let it go. He made this film almost 40 years ago. It's like, let it go. And that's the thing that I find fascinating too, to Shine. Because for full disclosure, folks, I've never read the book. I do want to read it one day. I know there are I know there's a lot of differences between the book and the novel, but it seems like everything Kubrick did, because I've never been able to figure out why Kubrick picked this as his next project following Barry Lyndon.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Because Kubrick very rarely started with an original idea. He always liked to adapt other people's things, even if he basically took them and just fundamentally altered them. Mm-hmm. Like, again, Dr. Strangelove was based on a book. Past Glory was based on a book. Clockwork Orange was clearly based on a book.
Yep.
And it's like, but why something? I would imagine Kubrick's thinking was, okay, Stephen King is an up and coming talent. If I take something he's done, it's going to give me a certain level of just I don't want to say notoriety because that's not fair or not the correct term, but it'll give me kind of just like a little bit of a boost.
Yeah,
it
it gives him that foundation. Yep.
Yeah. But the thing, though, is that in some of because I've been researching The Shining for years now, as I've stated. And even in preparation for this, I went back to a lot of the research I'd collected back in like 2013. And I found two conflicting pieces of information that Kubrick optioned the film rights for The Shining. But then I also heard that Warner Brothers had the film rights and gave them to Kubrick. And I don't mean gave in the sense that like money. I mean like, Warner Brothers was the ones who optioned it and gave the project to Kubrick to direct.
Oh, okay.
Because there's this thing that even like back in the day when I was in college, that when I would study again the filmmakers and just in new American cinema and all these different like cinema movements that were happening in like the 60s, 70s, I remember because again you had like your French New Wave cinema, you had your new American cinema of like the late 60s, early 70s, where like Easy Rider completely just like Hollywood was broken at that time, but Easy Rider was kind of like the rebirth of the Phoenix. And that's when the directors got more power. The studio system was dissolving, and that's when all the corporations were coming in, buying all of them. And in the meantime, when that was happening, was that all these corporations, whether it be golf, and you had like the soda companies, they didn't know what people wanted. They were buying these movie studios for wholesale prices, and they didn't know what people wanted. And so they would go to these young filmmakers like your Scorseses, your Coppolas, your De Palmas, and say, do whatever you want. You know what you just came out of film school. You know what the kids like these days. Here's some money. Go figure it out for yourself. And that's where you got things like The Exorcist, The Godfather, Jaws. It was just the whole idea. Jaws was more the studio system was coming back at that time, but you did have the idea of like, okay, we're going to entrust a director who has a vision along with the producers, and they're going to hopefully make us a lot of money.
Yeah. Yep.
But the weird thing about Kubrick that I've never been able to figure out was Kubrick was always, for the most part, a studio guy. He was never, except for his very early films, kind of like The Killing, and not even Passive Glory, because Passive Glory was Kirk Douglas. Kubrick always was an establishment person. But the weird thing was that he somehow survived the studio system of the 50s, then the dissolving of the studio system in the 60s, and then the reforging of it in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
And then while all that was going on, nobody ever bothered him.
Okay.
Because in Kubrick's history was because he did The Killing with Sterling Hayden, and that was more or less an independent picture in the sense that like I don't think any studio really didn't give him any money, or if he did have a studio, but it wasn't a big picture. And then after that, he does Passive Glory, and that was the Kirk Douglas thing. And Kirk Douglas had all the resources in the world because he was matinee idol Kirk Douglas.
Yeah.
And then I'm trying to think, what came after Passive Glory? Was it Spartacus? Whoever it was. Spartacus came next. So. And what happened was Kirk Douglas originally had another director for Spartacus, and him and Kirk Douglas didn't get along well. So he hired Kubrick because he knew Kubrick was a competent filmmaker. And most people, okay, Lolita's in there somewhere too. I forget where Lolita figures into all this. But during Spartacus though, that's when Kubrick and Kirk Douglas really started to like butt heads. Whereas I think there's a quote, I think in one of Kirk Douglas's autobiographies, he says the phrase, "He's the most talented little shit I've ever seen." and so that was when Kubrick really, I think there's a documentary out there. I'm not sure if Rob's ever seen it, called The Life in Pictures. And it's about 2.5 hours long, but it goes through all of Kubrick's projects. And unfortunately, they're all like kind of like bite size. So you get some insights.
But nothing really gets the time it deserves type of thing?
Yeah, which is fair. Again, you probably could do a 6-hour-long documentary on Spartacus, never mind 2001 and A Clockwork Orange and yada, 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 going down the entire line. And that's when kind of like Kubrick was getting frustrated with the Hollywood system because he didn't like people telling him what to do. Like most artists, he didn't want to be told what was off limits and what was. And so then I think after that was Lolita. And the big thing was that, like, with the production, that was back before the MPAA, you had the production code. In Lolita, again, everybody who knows the story of the book of Lolita, it really was this controversial number of this old man kind of screwing around with this underage girl.
Yep.
And when you say underage girl, you're not talking about 16. You're talking about like a 10-year-old girl.
Yeah, Lolita's concept gets canceled today.
Oh, well, Lolita as a concept was canceled back in the 60s, more or less.
Definitely.
Yeah. She wasn't jail-based. She was a child. That's Lolita, folks. That's why I have all Kubrick's films. Lolita's always my least favorite because I just think it's just an icky premise.
Mm-hmm.
That everybody in the movie has the hots for, like, even though I think Sue Lyons, I think that was Lolita. Even though she's like supposed to be like 14 or 16 in that, it's still just an icky premise having a bunch of grown men just ogling a teenager. But anyway, though, so that was another one too, where Kubrick really, like, the production code came down on him and he really couldn't move. And that's when I really think he started to get close to the studio system with 2001.
Okay.
And that's when really everybody's kind of left Kubrick alone. And that kind of ties into the fact that, like, the whole thing with the moon landing footage and all that, it was like at the same time that Kubrick got left alone was on his most experimental film.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, you look at Kubrick's filmography, and 2001 is clearly the most avant-garde of all those, and yet it's the one that was the most successful and he was left the most alone with. And it just, well, he was left after 2001. Everybody left him alone. Nobody really questioned him because he was, at that point, he was Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was always, he was in the system, but he never was forced to play by the system's rules.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the not tangential, but the minor knowledge I have of him as a director in the industry is that he got to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah, which was also very, like, that was, and even though that was not unheard of by the time you got to the late 60s, early 70s, it was very, very rare before that. And it was even rarer come the 80s.
Yep, absolutely.
And 90s. Like, everybody looks, it's funny, like, everybody complains about, like, Stanley Kubrick's last film, Eyes Wide Shut, is like, oh, it's such a disappointing last film of his. And it's like, folks, he made, like, a 3-hour-long movie about, like, oh, God. What would you call it, Rob? Oh, God, oh, God, what would you call Eyes Wide Shut to people? What's the word for this? Well, there's a lot of things that can be said about Eyes Wide Shut. But oh, God, I want to say deep state, but that's not the right word. That's more.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I feel like it's right on the tip of my tongue, but I can't think of the exact phrase for it.
Like Freemasons almost. What would you call that?
Yeah, like
Illuminati. Illuminati.
Yeah, the people pulling the strings in the background. Yep.
The puppet master. Yes. Think about it. And it's funny that we have all these conspiracy theories about Kubrick and the moon landing, but we had his final films about, like, the sex orgies of the Illuminati, and, like, 6 days after the final cut is shown, he dies of a heart attack in his sleep. Nobody talks about that. I don't want to be throwing around conspiracy theories, but come on. Come on.
This is the last episode of Cinemoddity. Zach and I are going to have committed suicide with bullets to the back of each other's heads.
But it's true, though. Like, come on.
Oh, yeah.
6 days after he shows the final cut of Eyes Wide Shut, he dies all of a sudden of a heart attack in his sleep. Because that definitely can't be faked. Like, come on, folks. Let's think for a second. Let's put our thinking caps on. But no, like, you have all that going on with The Shining. Like, Kubrick was, like, in every single sense of the word, a maverick. He did what he wanted. He had no oversight, even the slightest. And so when you look at The Shining and you look at all the weird kind of just, like, insane stuff that happens in that movie, you can't help but think there has to be some sort of deeper meaning to all this, because there's so many. And yes, the Room 237 people are eccentric. I think that's the nicest way of putting it. Mm-hmm. But I do think they highlight a lot of things that happen in that movie on a cinematic filmmaking level that would happen by accident if any other filmmaker were making that film, yes, but not if it's Stanley Kubrick.
And that's where I agree with what they're saying, at least in the concept of it. Because, you know, that's what we know about Stanley Kubrick. He is a perfectionist, was a perfectionist. Nothing was ever done by accident. And it gives that grounding to why it's interesting and worthwhile to talk about this film in such an abstract way.
Yeah, because there's certain scenes in this, like I think I mentioned it, like the ball, the TV set, but the one that's always been one of the more fascinating ones for me in recent years is it's rather early in the film that Jack is sitting at the typewriter and Shelley Duvall comes up to him and the chair disappears for one shot.
Yep, that, and ever since I saw Room 237, I can never miss it now. The shot where when Ullman is showing the family around the hedge maze and they're walking back towards the hotel, and it looks like a car is about to drive directly into them, and then it cuts, and the car is not there anymore. And that, I think, whenever we get to our theories of The Shining, stuff like that plays a role, because while I never noticed it in my initial viewings, or many viewings of The Shining until I saw Room 237, they still, me being the weird conspiracy theorist that I am, can take those and rationalize them into my narrative of the film. So that's where I find it interesting, where it's like, no, I hate when people are like, this chair's gone. Man, we sure fucked up the Native Americans. It's like, no. Those are not related, okay? That's where I detach from that movie a little bit more. The Native American, the genocide, the Holocaust stuff. But I love just them pointing that stuff out, for sure.
Yeah, because some of the behind-the-scenes stuff I was watching, and probably the clearest example of Kubrick, because that's the weird thing, because you look, if it was any other filmmaker, the chair thing would be a continuity error. But the thing that kind of it's hard to explain to people, and I didn't even include this in my presentation in college because I couldn't figure out how to explain it to people in under a minute, is when we go in to Ullman's office and we have the impossible window.
Oh, yeah.
The impossible window is one of those things where it's like you look at it and it's clear. It as much as, again, these people in the Room 237 film are, I don't want to call them kooky, but I want to call it more stream of consciousness, because I don't think they're insane. I think they put a lot of thought into it. And I don't think they're out on the street corner with a cardboard sign that says the end is nigh.
Oh yeah. I think that's something that I think we're both in agreement there, where, these are smart people putting time and effort into a critical analysis of this movie, regardless of what I or Zach thinks about how ridiculous some of their theories are. It's meaningful. It's worthwhile. It's someone's concept of this movie. That's interesting.
Yeah. But I think there's a lot of examples of this, like I already mentioned, but the Stuart Ullman, and for those of you who just haven't watched The Shining recently, rather early in the film, I think, guys, in the first 15 minutes of the film, Jack Nicholson walks into the manager of the Overlook Hotel's office, Mr. Ullman, and we see a hallway shot, and he goes into Mr. Ullman's office, and there's this big window behind his desk.
Yep.
And the window shouldn't be there, because and it's never shown in the film, and it's slightly hinted at in one of the behind the scenes featurettes from Kubrick's daughter. We actually, in the behind the scenes footage, she follows Jack Nicholson from his room, I guess wherever he was sleeping at night, onto location of the set, and we walk down the hallway, and instead of making the left-hand turn where the window should be, we make a right-hand turn. But you see for a brief, maybe 30 frames, you can see that it's more hallway.
Yep.
It's confirmed there's no window behind that set. And so, okay, clearly Kubrick, when he designed this, wanted there to be an impossible window. Yeah. He wanted that for some reason. Kubrick never did. That's another thing too. Kubrick was, I don't want to say he was a recluse, but he definitely appreciated his privacy. And ever since A Clockwork Orange, he very rarely ever gave interviews to press.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's the sad thing, is that we will never have a concrete answer to this. Yeah.
I mean, part of me is like, oh, that's a bummer, because I love having some resolution to things. But at the same time, that there's, like I say it with a lot of stuff I'm into, sometimes letting your imagination run is better than having the exact answer. And this is one of those cases with The Shining and with Kubrick where I'm on the fence. I don't know what would be better, because sure, I would love to have a definitive answer, but if we don't have the definitive answer and we just have speculation and conspiracy, this is the one thing where I'm kind of like, okay, everybody, you got to realize you're grasping at straws at a certain point. And I think that's where my kind of belief or my willingness to think about these conspiracies break down, because even with Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, I will work that book to death, and I still do. But there's some things I read about it and hear people say, and I'm like, no, like you're grasping at straws even for this. That's kind of crazy. And that's where that balance lies. And yes, there's so much going on in The Shining that we're never going to get an answer to, but there's just as much and more going on in these people's brains since this movie has come out. And that's, like I've been saying, I think some of my issue, we can't take what they're saying as any way truth or objective. It's all subjective based on their experiences and opinions.
Yes, but how I'm looking at the Room 237 people is that I'm taking them more as like okay, look at the movie The Shining as like a text, and they are just highlighting specific passages. I'm not really agreeing with their analysis of it, but I'm agreeing with what they've pointed out.
Yes, I think that I'm right there with you. Absolutely. Yep.
Because there's one point too, I know like very early in the documentary, I keep saying documentary, whatever it is, in the film, and I'm sorry, I just can't say film because I can mean either one. In the room, in the room,
in
the moon room. There's a point where I think it's the one woman who's part of all this. She says, "Oh, the Minotaur poster." And I always kind of figured, oh, the Minotaur in the labyrinth. I've always kind of thought that's kind of like a kooky notion. But she has a point. Earlier in the film, Ullman says, we don't do any skiing here. Mm-hmm. Then why would there be a skiing poster in the game room if there's never any winter skiing here?
Okay, sure.
It's like, don't get me wrong. It's the notion, not that like she's right and like, okay, Stanley Kubrick wanted like Minotaur imagery in this. I'm not saying she's right in that sense though.
Yeah.
But I do think a lot of what Kubrick did in this was that, because again, I've read somewhere that he had like a 200 IQ. And he apparently was a master tactician. But the joke was that anytime he had a new movie production, he would hustle people with his chess skills.
Okay. And
I'm thinking that Kubrick might have been so bored by filmmaking. I think about it. Kubrick, most people would agree, his best film is 2001.
Mm-hmm.
Not just in the sense of within his canon, but I think it's widely agreed upon just film scholars across the globe that 2001 is the pinnacle of science fiction.
Absolutely, yeah. You hear that all the time when you see those lists and look up those articles. Absolutely.
Yeah, you'll be hard pressed to ever make a science fiction film half as good as 2001.
Yeah, as I've said before on this podcast, of the people who think they can objectively rank media, that's up there. 2001's up there. Ulysses by James Joyce is up there. People might not agree with them, but the group of people that feel they can objectively rank the best, those always come up, and that's just a fact.
Yeah, there's certain undeniable truths of existence, and I do think that. And I think there's even an argument to be made too that even beyond science fiction, 2001's probably one of the very few films you can get to perfection in celluloid form. We'll save that for the space movie series that's coming up maybe sometime in the future. Pardon the pun. But no, so like it's the idea that like if you're Stanley Kubrick, and let's just assume for the sake of argument, you have a 200 IQ, you've essentially made your opus at this point, and you're making I don't want to say schlocky, but compared to 2001, compared to Barry Lyndon, you are making schlock.
Yep.
What do you do when you're making schlock? You got to keep yourself entertained. So what you do is you throw in a bunch of just impossible imagery to sit there. I don't want to say confuse the audience, but kind of the old adage: you might not have noticed it, but your brain did.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they even say one of the people interviewed said that there's research and there's evidence that Kubrick was into subliminal.
Yep, the subliminal messaging. How did advertisers use those tricks? And he tried to use the same tricks in the movie, is what they say.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking, is that Kubrick might have been, I don't want to say bored, but he wanted to kind of like exercise his intellect, and he threw a bunch of things in here just to see, like, okay, how can I disorient the audience without them even knowing? I think there's a lot of that here, whether it be, again, the TV with no electrical cord, the luggage, the Playgirl magazine. There's so much in this movie, like we talked about them walking across the road and the cars there. There's also all the establishing shots of the Overlook where there's no maze. There's no hedge maze in any of the establishing shots.
Yep, absolutely.
And I find that sort of stuff being like, okay, like we've established, nothing Kubrick did was by accident. He never made mistakes. And like we've said numerous times too, I'm sorry, we haven't said it this far, was that Kubrick was known for doing multiple takes. Like there would be dozens upon dozens of takes of everything. So if there's a
hundreds in some cases, right?
That's the rumors that there were hundreds.
Sure.
That's always been the extreme, that like there's certain takes of certain scenes. I think in Eyes Wide Shut, the scene between Tom Cruise and like Sidney Pollack is the most shot sequence in any film in like history.
Okay.
Because he shot it, he did like 200 takes with the original with Harvey Keitel. And then when he reshot the entire movie with Sidney Pollack, he had to do another 200 takes. So I think that scene, I forget where it is. I read that though, but apparently there's like 400 takes of that one sequence.
Love it. That's what I would do if I was a director. I would just be like, pushing people to the limit type of thing.
Well, that's what he did, though. And that's why they say, I know in some of the behind the scenes stuff, they say that's where like you get the shot where after Wendy drags Jack into the food, the what do you want to call it? The
storage pantry or whatever.
Yeah, the food pantry, and she locks him in there, and we get the POV shot of the camera under Jack with his head down, being like, "Wendy, honey, I'm hurting real bad." Apparently,
I think you hit my head.
Apparently, like that was like a 40 or 50th take.
Let me out of here and I'll forget the whole goddamn thing. It'll be just like nothing ever happened. Wendy, baby, I think you hurt my head real bad. I'm dizzy. I need a doctor. Honey, don't leave me in here.
I'm gonna go now.
Oh, yeah. I think they mentioned briefly in 237 where it's like he do so many takes, use all these weird camera angles and see which one fit, type of thing. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Even when we see Jack, like the second time we see him walking down the corridors, he's about to go into the gold room. When he's like kind of like, not the first time, but the second time where he's really kind of like having like that hissy fit where he's sitting there doing his thing. Apparently there were so many takes of him he walks down the thing normally. He walks down the thing slightly agitated. A little agitated. Then they did the exact same thing. He walks down hugging the right side of it, normal.
Okay.
Slightly agitated, slightly more agitated, to the point where there was like 40 or 50 takes of him just walking down a hallway, just each time slightly more agitated, and then different just ways of him on one side of the corridor, in the middle, slightly to the left, slightly to the right, all the way to the right. And that's what Kubrick did was that. And then guess what? You frustrated your actors so much, you got a visceral performance out of them.
Yeah. And I feel like these stories come up and people hear about them and like, oh, wow, that's so excessive. That's crazy. This might just be, hindsight's 2020 and everything we've talked about and everything I've been exposed to. Isn't that just good filmmaking? You want to get different angles and shots and types of coverage so that when you're done shooting and you have to edit, you aren't missing anything. Like, I feel like that's all we talk about today is reshoots. And I'm like, if you just did your job the first time, of course, there's other behind-the-scenes things that go on that I'm not talking about in this point. But if you just had your coverage done well the first time, you wouldn't have to do reshoots that much. You wouldn't have to worry about it. If I was a director, I would want every shot from every conceivable angle, so I had the best thing to work with on the editing room cutting board.
Yes, but the thing though is that when you're in studio filmmaking or just any filmmaking period,
the bureaucracy weighs down on
Well, yes, but I think it even's more broader than that. I think it's the idea you have to be on time and on budget because people do have schedules. You just can't keep doing that. You just can't. I think about you have your actors. They have other commitments. You have all these things. You don't have the luxury to just keep doing it over and over and over again.
I thought actors were like trained animals. Like don't you just put like if you need two actors to kiss, you just put peanut butter on each other's mouths and they go for it type of thing? I thought that's what we were dealing with there.
There's a reason for the phrase as dumb as an actor. It's my personal dream that someday he could train actors to be useful to society, to help people perform simple tasks, maybe even to assist the elderly or the blind.
No, I know exactly what you're saying, and I know there's so much else that goes on in the movie business that I'm not privy to, and even stuff I'm sure that either of us are not privy to. But that when I hear these things, we're like, oh, isn't that crazy? Isn't that excessive? And it's like, no, that's him doing a good job. But I get what you're saying. There's a lot more going on.
But only someone like Stanley Kubrick or someone of his stature and with respect within Hollywood, which is very, like, even today, like I can only imagine like a Steven Spielberg would be the equivalent today that could take as long as he would need.
Okay.
And even and I think he would see it as a detriment that he had to do it that many times because that's just not his
at the same
style
time,
of filmmaking.
Yeah, that is you know, you have to have that in the film industry. You have to have that knowledge of the trade-off between how much time are you spending versus, you know, what marginal gains are you going to get in the final film type of thing. No, yeah, I'm coming at it from more of everything I work on is, well, not everything, because this podcast is not an example, but most other projects I work on are by myself and myself only. I know with writing, like I've pissed people off. They work with me with writing, and I'm like, I got this one like scene I have an idea of. I'm going to write it like one day a week for 5 weeks. I'm going to sit down and write this scene just 5 different ways. And they're like, what the hell's the point of that? And I'm like, because I'm going to be in a different mindset every time I write it, and that's going to change the motif of it. And they're like, man, just fucking write it once and get on with it. And I'm like, no, that's not the point. So there is that trade-off type of thing, and I get it. But I guess where I'm coming from is that attention to detail. I've said before, it's good filmmaking. I think I should say more, or a more appropriate version of it is I respect that about Kubrick and other filmmakers that are willing to take that time and drive that deep into such tiny details.
Oh yeah, and I think that's what it was too. Because he wants to get that visceral performance that you can't get. Like again, I forget on one of the documentaries, there's something like, how do you tell someone to be crazy? Okay, take one. It's like, okay, how do you do that in one take? Be crazy, and that's why like when you do get the axe going through the door and here's Johnny, that's like the 30th take.
Yeah.
Going to some of the more, again, the Room 237 film elements of this. Because I know at one point in the movie they talk about showing the film backwards and forwards at the same time.
Yes, which I thought was the like most interesting part of this, because that was something, everything else I feel, all the conspiracy theories you can go online, you can read about. This was something from Room 237, the playing it forward and backwards over each other with the overlays. I had never heard of that being done before, and I was actually like, whoa, this is a neat idea.
It's a really neat idea, and they have some great supporting evidence they show in the film. But I got 2 problems with it. One, the very beginning of that segment where they show them doing that, they have the FBI warning on the DVD included when they start both films. Or I'm sorry, one of the films.
Oh, which is not the part of the actual. Yeah.
No. And they're beginning the reverse of the film while this is happening. There's a shot of like, oh God, Jack with the picture frame.
Yep,
and you see the FBI warning. I'm like, okay, you've screwed up your time already.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like all those people, you know, everybody hears the urban legend of if you play Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd and watch Wizard of Oz, it'll match up. But if you dive into it any modicum further, you find that nobody knows when to start them at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, everything's just fucked then because it's all different.
Yeah, it's all a matter of just you see what you want to see. It's kind of like, you know what, if you go into the woods looking for Bigfoot, chances are whatever you see and hear is Bigfoot.
Exactly.
But my second complaint with that is that, and I'm not sure how much Rob looked into this, was that Kubrick cut a lot out of this movie during editing.
That was something I did. I knew we were going to get to it. That was something that I was looking at, you know, when I because I've had this film in my collection for a while. It's been on my hard drive, my first hard drive with the most movies on it for years, just because, you know, I got it from other people. But I was interested in like looking into, well, what's available today? Like, of course, you can still find it through, you know, sketchy websites. People will always share this movie. But just like the Terminator series, something that caught my attention was when I searched this, there were a few instances that said The Shining director's cut. There were a few other instances that said The Shining European cut. And I did a little digging, and I think that's what you're getting at, Zach. There's edits that were done to this movie that I don't think people have really tracked down and solidified throughout history. Like, I couldn't find good information on really, like, when I had my copy of the movie, I was like, well, is it the directors? Is it the European? Are the directors and European the same thing? Is it the American? And I really had no idea. And at a certain point, I was just like, well, screw it. I just want to watch this movie because I love this movie. And I gave up, kind of.
Yes. Okay. There are only 2 cuts of The Shining. Well, there's 2 official cuts of The Shining. There's a third, which we'll get into in a moment. There's the North American, there's the overall release, which is the one that's most widely available. There's the European release, which I think has about 30 minutes cut out of it. And there's certain things like the doctor at the beginning with Wendy and Danny, that's cut out. But and this is one of my favorite like film stories of all times, and I think Rob knows my fascination with lost media, is that apparently the story changes depending on who you talk to, because there's really there's official word, but there's an unofficial word, is that the first day or two when The Shining debuted, remember folks, this is back in 1980 when it wasn't like today where everything goes out in 6,000 theaters all at once. That didn't happen then.
Yeah.
Was that The Shining premiered in Los Angeles and in New York, and it had a sequence between when we see Jack frozen and when we see the tracking shot onto the picture frame of Jack in the picture, July something ball 1921?
Yeah, 1921, July 4th. Yep.
Yes. Between those 2 shots, there is a sequence that did exist of where we see Mr. Ullman, the Overlook manager, goes in. It's funny, the shooting script and what's the word they use for continuity pictures were taken of Mr. Ullman walks up, is in a hospital, and he walks into to a lobby. He asks the nurse, like, "Oh, I brought some flowers, Mrs. Torrance. May I see her?" He goes in, and him and Wendy have a talk about kind of like what happened, kind of like very ambiguous resolution. And while this is happening, Danny's outside with the nurse. And when Mr. Ullman and Wendy talk, and Mr. Ullman says, "Oh, you have a place you're going to stay after this?" And she goes, "No." He goes, "Well, I have this really gorgeous place on the beach. I won't take no for an answer. You and Danny can stay with me for a few months until you get on your feet." And as he's leaving, he asks the nurse, like, "Oh, do you have a vase for these flowers?" And she goes, "Oh, sure, I'll go get one." And as the nurse walks away, Mr. Ullman looks at Danny and says something. I forget. It's online. You can find it.
Okay.
He says something like, "Take care of yourself, kid." And he throws him Jack's tennis ball and he walks away. And then we cut back to the Overlook as we pan through. We do the tracking shot of the music and we see Jack in the picture of July 4th, 1921.
Oh, okay.
And plus, there's also apparently footage too, is that there was a scrapbook sequence, because if you remember back to the Mr. Grady bathroom thing, Jack says to Mr. Grady, like, "Oh, I saw your picture in this book," and that sequence is in the movie. Kubrick, because I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump ahead. I'll get back to that in a moment.
Okay.
What happened with the Mr. Ullman, I don't want to say epilogue, because it wasn't an epilogue, it was before the end of the film, was that apparently that was in theaters for a day, maybe 2 tops. And something happened where Kubrick watched the film with a crowd and didn't like that scene. And so what he did was he contacted, I think it was Warner Brothers, because I think this is a Warner Brothers film.
Yep.
And he said, "I want this scene out." And Warner Brothers had extreme loyalty to Kubrick. They always did. They kept Kubrick as close as they could. And they actually hired 2 editors, one in New York, one in California, and chauffeured them around the cities in limousines, and they went into each theater, and Kubrick had it down to which frame from frame A to frame B of this shot, of this sequence, and had them cut it out. And the person who was in charge of doing this in New York is named. Again, it's easily accessible. You can find it online, folks. But the one in Los Angeles has never been identified.
Okay.
And apparently, the New York editor who was assigned to this has been asked numerous times what happened to the footage. And what he says was he put it in a briefcase, handed it to the Warner Brothers executives, and he never saw it again. And so the $1 million question is, did this footage survive?
Yeah.
Did Kubrick have it destroyed? And even if Kubrick had it destroyed in about the dozen or so prints that were floating around that time, did he keep it in his own records? Because think about it. He only had those sequences excised from the prints in theaters. He didn't, who knows, maybe he had them destroyed in his own archives.
Yeah, the
We'll never
actual,
know.
the masters or whatever they're called for filmmaking, yep.
So we'll never know. And I know a few years ago when it came to 2001, there was always rumors for 2001: A Space Odyssey that there was about 20 minutes of that film that was edited out and was considered lost. It was found to be in a salt mine somewhere.
Yeah.
That it was always in Warner Brothers' hands. And Warner Brothers has said, like, it was always, apparently this is the official story, who knows how true it is, that in Kubrick's final will and testament it was, my films are never to be touched.
Oh, okay.
Warner Brothers has said, we have the excised footage from 2001, but we're never releasing it.
Gotcha.
So it's preserved, but no one, unless you are in the archives,
Yeah.
which isn't exactly a conference room somewhere in Hollywood. It's probably a salt mine somewhere in the Midwest.
Yep.
You ain't seeing that footage. And then the $1 million question is, where is this Mr. Ullman hospital footage? Does it exist?
Mm-hmm.
It's anyone's guess at this point.
Yeah. And interesting layers of mystery around it, for sure.
Yeah. So do you have any insights about that, Rob, or any guesses? Or
I don't know. I mean, I've always kind of been one where I know that, things get cut from movies, things get changed in movies. I've always been one to kind of, just take the movie as is and go with that. And I think that's something I've done with The Shining. But I'm not against seeing footage that was edited out, that was lost from a film. I don't know if it would change my opinions on the film. I wouldn't take it as, like, oh, it ruined my childhood, or, oh, it just gives me a whole new opinion on it. It's more of like just a kind of slight addendum, it seems. So I would love to have it, but I don't think it's necessary. It's necessary if you want answers from Kubrick, but as far as I'm concerned, The Shining is The Shining as we have it, and it's always going to go down as such. If we ever got more information on it, that's great, but that's not going to overhaul, I think, what I or the majority think about it.
This is my opinion on that, is that if Kubrick being the master strategist that he was, and you look at whoever it was, something bothered Kubrick about that sequence with Mr. Ullman at the end.
Okay.
So you don't go through that much effort unless it really bothers you. And think of how many times Kubrick must have watched that sequence up until that point that he was okay with it. And it wasn't until it got into the hands of mass audiences, and not even like the masses. We're talking maybe like a few thousand people tops. Because the thing has always been, it played at least one day.
Okay.
That's known for, it's either 1 or 2 days. That's always been the thing. It's either 1 or 2, definitely 1. And what was happening? What was an audience's reaction to that clip that bothered him so much that he felt it was detracting from the overall film?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm thinking about it in terms of, well, how does that fit into what I think about this movie? But like I said, I don't want to fall into that trap, because this is just something that was cut out. But like you're saying, some people saw it. Some people saw this as the film. This scene was included. I don't know. Stanley Kubrick doesn't strike me as one to be like, oh, the audience didn't, this. I don't know. I'm kind of torn, because at one point, I can't imagine that it was the audience didn't receive it well, so I'm taking it out. I would imagine it's more like the audience saw this in a light I did not want them to. Like, I'm thinking of, like, we've talked about it before, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, where everybody knows that book as lampooning of the meatpacking industry, when that's not what it's about. There's like 2 pages about the meat industry. It's really about socialism. Maybe Kubrick felt the same way, that including that scene, it was misguiding his viewers to the message he wanted them to have. That's the only thing I can get a sense of for someone, as we talked about, as clear cut with their intentions as Kubrick was.
Yeah, I've always, because I do think, because again, going back to the thing I was about to say and I cut myself off, was that there apparently is a scrapbook with Mr. Grady. And I wonder, I just wonder if there's a part of this, because that's always been a big question about this. I think you brought it up earlier on, was that how much of this is just Jack Torrance's descent into insanity, and how much of is it the spookiness of the hotel or the supernatural of the hotel.
Yeah.
And I know in one of the behind the scenes documentaries on the Shining Blu-ray, the screenwriter that Kubrick had with the film, let me see what her name is right now, Diane Johnson, she talks about the sequence where Jack is in the food pantry and he gets the door unlatched. And I know in room 237 they say it could only be Danny or Wendy who let him out.
Yeah, what they say, it's either Danny or Wendy, or you have to accept that something supernatural is going on.
Yes, but in the behind the scenes stuff, Diane Johnson says Kubrick and I had to, and I forget the specific word she used. It was a very specific term. She goes, we had to concede that something supernatural had to allow the plot to go forward.
Oh,
she did.
Great. I like that because it makes so much. The thing I'm going to relate that scene to when we dive into it, that is exactly what like the parody of that scene that I'm going to bring up does, where it's like we just consent that the plot needs to move forward. That's interesting.
But that's the thing, though. Like, if Kubrick was this man with a 200 IQ that was playing, like, forget 3D chess, he was playing 4-dimensional chess with the audience, he wouldn't do that. Like, that's the thing, though. If Kubrick was playing with this film and doing things like, again, the TV, the ball rolling down the hallway, all these things. And plus, we haven't even addressed the fact that there's so much, like, mirror imagery in this. There's a very sharp duality present in The Shining. There's all these mirror things happening. And I just wonder, though, is that, like, what was he trying to get at with this? And not that, like, it is not like one of those times where it's kind of like when people ask David Lynch, what's Eraserhead about? I'm not saying I want that sort of just like, oh God, what was his name? Darren Aronofsky with Mother, where he, like, within like 15 minutes of the film being out, he's like, it's global warming. She's Mother Earth. We're hurting the planet. I don't want to be spoon-fed this. I don't want the playing into here comes the food. I don't want that. But I just wonder, though, is that, like, what was Kubrick's, again, he's making a horror movie, but outside of the last, like, 15 minutes of the film, there's really nothing blatantly supernatural about this film.
Well, I think this is where we're getting more into the discussion of what I think this film is, because I do think that everything that happens to this family is, I'm doing air quotes, supernatural to some extent. I don't view this movie as just Jack Torrance slipping into madness. I view it as something a little grander. And I don't think it's like a ghost opened the pantry door. I have a very different opinion about the setting of this film that ties back to literature. I just don't know if we want to get into that yet, type of thing. To answer your point, I think the whole movie is supernatural. I think that everything is supernatural about this. Supernatural in the sense of there's forces at work that aren't just our characters.
Well, I've always, and maybe this is the part where we start talking about what we think about the movie and, like, what it's about, because I've always, and it's not until really preparing for this discussion that I've thought about those. So you think about, like, Jack. It's like, why does Jack die at the end of the movie? Well, okay, let me rephrase that. Why does Jack freeze to death?
Okay.
Oh, I'm not. It's not just a rhetorical question. It's an actual question, and it's that why does he die? It's that, like, yes, he gets trapped in the hedge maze and he freezes to death, but what? Again, if he's being powered by supernatural forces,
I think we might have to get into this because I don't think he dies at the end. I don't think death or life is a construct in this movie. I think I'm going to just say it. My opinion of this movie is that the Overlook Hotel, very much akin to a novel that came out maybe I think about 7 or 8 years prior to Stephen King's The Shining. I think about Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut and Cat's Cradle, I believe, revolves around a place that is unstuck in time. That's what I think of this movie as. I think as soon as Jack gets to the hotel at the beginning, him and his whole family are no longer experiencing time linearly. They are just this amalgamation of all events that have happened and will always happen and have yet to happen. And so when he dies, when somebody opens the door to the pantry, when Wendy sees the guest with the slash in his head at the end who says, "Great party, isn't it?" I don't think time, life and death don't matter anymore. The concept of life and death only exists with time. you can't be dead unless you were once alive. But if everything happens simultaneously, which I believe everything's flashing in and out in this film, none of that matters. It doesn't matter that he doesn't die to me at the end of the movie. He just reaches the end of one kind of pathway that his character led him on. Like, I think at the beginning of the film, when Ullman says, oh, there was this guy in the 30s and he went crazy and killed his family, I think that is Jack Torrance. I think he did kill those twins. I think he is Grady. But nobody knows any understanding of this unstuck in time concept. It's all just moving around them, and we're perceiving it through the lens of a linear time being. And like, there's other things that we can get into with my theory of this, like the chair disappearing that we mentioned. That's a great touch of just, in one scene, the chair's there, the next scene, it's not. Because maybe that chair wasn't there in 1980. Maybe that chair was actually there in 1927. But time doesn't matter. It's all coming and going, flashing in and out in this one location. So I know that's something they don't touch upon at all in Room 237. That's just what I've come to think of the movie as. But that I feel it's necessary to say because I don't think about it as anybody dying or living. I think of everything happening at the same time. We just get it forced through the piping bag of our own perception.
Yes, I agree with that for the most part, in the sense of like how just in preparation for this, I think kind of come to the conclusion, like you said, there's two different realities happening. I think there's probably multiple realities happening at the same time with the Overlook Hotel.
Well, I said Cat's Cradle. It's Slaughterhouse 5. I have to correct myself before we get any angry emails.
well, I was going to say something though, but I didn't want to embarrass some folks. But like I agree with you in the sense that like the Overlook Hotel is some sort of, and this is never even like hinted at in the film, but it's more kind of our own like analysis. It's like a vortex in time.
Yes.
It's like a crossroads of all this weird stuff happening. And that's why, again, Wendy does see all these just kind of like bizarre events happening all at once. But the thing though is, and this is hinted at in Room 237, is Danny can shine and Jack can probably shine because I think it's Scatman Crothers that says it's passed down from family member to family member through generations.
Yeah, because he's talking about, he's like, me and my grandma, we could always have conversations without ever moving our mouths and stuff like that. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that clearly there's multiple things going on here in the sense that both Danny and Jack are able to experience it. But the part that kind of throws it out the window is then, how is Wendy in the middle of all this? Because the Wendy stuff, even though it feels very, and I think they even say it in the film, it's very Saturday morning cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
But how is she able to see any of this?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I've taken it as more of the people who have the shining or can shine. It's like they can feel that or see or interact in some way the fact that this place, the Overlook Hotel, is unstuck in time. But people who don't have the shining, even though they can't feel it and interact with it the way that Danny does, they still have to experience it.
Well, that's the thing, though. And this kind of goes back to the Mr. Ullman thing from the Excise clip. Because, like you said, it's like, oh, Jack doesn't die. Jack, and I think the film makes a very big point of that. It's like, oh, Jack didn't die because he's always existed. It's kind of like, how do you kill something that's always in motion? It's just, It can't cease if it never existed. But the thing though is, if you go back to the shooting script of this alternate scene, you have, I'm going to I have it now in front of me. When Mr. Ullman's talking to Wendy, he goes, Danny's looking real well. He seems to have adjusted very well, all things considered. Oh, I spoke to Lieutenant Elliott on the way over here, and he said they finished with this silly business about their investigation. He said he'd be over here this evening to tell you himself. Wendy, does this mean we're free to leave? Ullman, of course you are. Oh, about the things you saw at the hotel. He told me they've really gone over the place with a fine-tooth comb and didn't find the slightest evidence of anything at all out of the ordinary. Mrs. Torrance, I think I know how you must feel about this, but it's perfectly understandable for someone to imagine such things when they've been through something like you have. You mustn't think about it anymore. Have you decided where you're going when you leave here? And that's the thing about the beach house.
Oh, okay.
And the thing about it, let me find the rest of it about the end with Danny. All right. So, okay, Mr. Ullman's about to walk out. He walks out of Wendy's room. He goes out to like the nurse's office with Danny, like next to the nurse. He goes, oh, okay, Ullman, I'm on my way. I brought Mrs. Torrance some flowers. Could you have someone put these in a vase? Nurse, yes, I will. Ullman, goodbye, Danny. See you tomorrow. Danny, bye. Ullman moves away, then turns. Ullman, oh, Danny, I forgot to give you this. Catch. He throws the yellow ball to Danny. Ullman, see you tomorrow, Danny. Ullman leaves. Hold on, Danny. And that's the thing, though, is that it seems like Ullman, and I don't want to say that Ullman's like the ultimate bad guy here, but like you take his scene in the beginning of the film where he's in his little office with the impossible window, and he makes the comment being like, oh, my whatever he says, my superiors in blah or whatever is didn't tell you about what really happened out here with the caretaker last time from like 10 years ago who murdered everybody. And I wonder if Kubrick felt that by cutting the Ullman scene, it makes him out to be the bad guy, or because I get a feeling too with the ending with Jack is that it feels like Jack, the reason why Jack ceases in the maze, because think about it, if in that deleted scene, he says the police didn't find anything. They didn't find a Jack Torrance frozen body in the middle of the hedge maze. But we very clearly see, we don't just see Jack Torrance collapse from exposure. We see the following morning of his frozen body. And that, in a way, I would feel that scene does more detriment to the film than the Mr. Ullman does at the end.
Yeah, because the Mr. Ullman thing, I'm kind of going back and forth, because this is really the first time I think I've heard it to a great extent as you've described it, where, you know, it kind of, with my theory at least, that would make it seem like, you know, oh, we didn't find anything, and it's like, Danny, you can shine, I know you know something went on, but nothing really happened. Like, he's the one who's kind of aware of the properties of this hotel, and he's trying to make sure that the people that encountered it and got away from it, Danny and Shelley Duvall, don't, you know, think anything more of it, type of thing.
Yeah. Oh, and apparently there was a text card that said, we go past the picture frame on the wall, and it cuts to fade into this title onto black. Quote, the Overlook would survive this tragedy as it had so many others. It is still open each year from May 20th to September 20th. It is closed for the winter. And that's kind of like, and that got cut out too. And that was after the picture.
Okay.
And that's why I wonder, because remember, there's also, and they don't cover it this much in room, they highlight it a little bit in Room 237, but they don't really delve into it any sort of depth. But there's also the character of Bill Watson, who's the active day keeper of the hotel during the on season.
Yeah.
And it's like, what role does he have? Because even you have him there, and while Ullman is explaining this entire story to Jack very early in the film, Bill Watson's just kind of sitting there. And he doesn't look, he looks very perturbed, or almost like it's as if Ullman's, I don't want to say spilling the beans, or just like, oh, I don't know. There's something about this. I feel like Ullman is a bigger picture to this story than maybe Kubrick ever wanted him to be.
Okay.
Or in the way, because my theory about Jack in the hedge maze is that the hotel is what gives all these, and again, I'm just saying supernatural in the sense to differentiate it from people like Wendy. I think it's the idea it gives all these entities that can shine almost like an enhanced power. And the moment they leave, he leaves the hotel, that he's out of the vortex now.
Oh, interesting. I like that. Yeah.
I don't know how true it is. I'm just kind of like thinking out loud.
Sure.
But I get that feeling that there's more to it. Like the hotel is the vortex. And once you leave the vortex, because it doesn't seem like Jack has ever been aware of this sort of thing prior to when he comes to the Overlook. Because we do get to some of the lines of dialogue with him and Danny where he's like, and I think also with Wendy, like, I could just feel like I could live here forever. I feel right at home.
Yeah.
It's the idea that like Jack is empowered in this very specific location. And once he leaves its premises, that's it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
He's cut off. There's no tether. And that's why once he leaves the bounds of it all, he's out.
I like that, because that fits also with, of course, you know, a big part of the actual movie, The Shining, I would say, is that scene when he's talking to Grady in the bathroom, and Grady's like, did you know your son's trying to bring outside people here? And Jack Torrance is like, no, that's a bad thing. I need to stop it. where he's really kind of getting this feeling of this place and almost getting addicted to it. It needs to be his and his only.
Yeah.
Oh, right on.
I think there's a lot more, again, like, yes, you have your superficial, like, spooky house movie or spooky hotel movie, but there's also things too, like there's the really, like, fun story that the reason, I think, in the original novel, the room is room 230, 217?
217, yeah.
And the reason's always been for years that the reason why they had to change it was because the owner of the Stanley Hotel said, "Oh, if you use this real number, no one will ever want to stay in that room."
Mm-hmm.
And then it came out that the Stanley Hotel doesn't have a room 217.
I mean, like, years after the fact, that was my problem with that part in the documentary where someone's like, I called the hotel and they said they don't have that room number. And I was like, did you call them in 1979 or 78? Because that's when it would matter.
Well,
room numbers get changed a lot in a lot of cases. It's crazy. So I would not be surprised if they had one and it's lost. Like, I hold that with very little credibility.
Well, okay, but think of it that way, though. You're the Stanley Hotel. Stephen King writes a bestseller that's based on your hotel. Why wouldn't you keep that number?
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's like that's publicity. Absolutely.
That's what I mean. I think that's one of those things where, again, we have to take them at face value. Like any sort of film like this, you have to at least give them the benefit of the doubt they're not blatantly lying to you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But that's the thing, though, is I want, because we haven't even talked about the very specific room 237 in this discussion so far.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not until that room comes into the story is when, like, all hell starts to break loose.
Yes, when that door gets opened by the moon room key.
Yes, the moon room key. And that's the question, too, is that who opens room 237, which I would imagine is the Pandora's box of the Overlook Hotel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's why I wonder, is like, okay, who, and that's when everybody's so concerned about who lets Jack out of the food pantry, where the real question is, who got the key to room 237 and unlocked it? Because Danny's surprised by it. Jack is only notified by it until when Wendy tells him.
Yep.
And why would Wendy unlock it if she's, again, why would she act so surprised that Danny got in there if she's the one who unlocked it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, just where the unstuck in time theory comes into play, because it's like, it doesn't matter. In this story, to me, nobody physically went and opened that door. It just matters that it was open at one point, so our characters have the chance to see it at that point. And that, I think, goes along with the same thing where, Jack Nicholson goes into the room, sees this very young woman who he starts to dance with. I have to mention the music during that scene. Totally made me think of Under the Skin.
Yeah.
I was like, I've heard this before. Like someone with a naked woman. And I was like, oh man, this is Under the Skin. So I'll have to do a clip comparison to that. But he's holding her, and then in an instant, she becomes this decaying body. And that to me is what unstuck in time means. You don't get to see it when it happens. It just happens. One moment a chair's there, one moment it's gone. One moment there's a woman, one moment it's a corpse that's decaying. And that's part of the thing where it's like, there is no answer to who opened it. It's just the fact that someone opened it at one point. But I agree with you at the same time, that part of my theory doesn't delve or describe the concept, which I also agree with you, that Room 237 is a Pandora's box in some sense.
Yeah. Because that's when, because I do wonder too also how much of this that Cooper cut out. Because we have a moment where we see Wendy is talking to Jack, because while all this is going on, we have Jack screaming at okay. Again, I don't know my specific scene order, but we have Danny with his big wheel. He drives past room 237, sees the door unlocked and opened. He turns around and looks at it. And the next thing we see is Jack at his desk, slumped over, and he's screaming in his sleep, right?
Yeah, well, I think the next thing we get is Shelley Duvall actually doing work in the hotel. And she hears Jack's screams while he's having the nightmare and goes to run with them. And that's when we get that the shot of, she's helping him out. And then Danny comes into scene, and it's, the camera's set up behind the typewriter, Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. Danny comes in and she's like, Danny, go back to your room. And it cuts to behind Danny, seeing them in the distance. And he just stands there, and she eventually goes up to him, and she sees the bruises on his neck. And that's where we get that whole thing going. Cause she's at first like, you did this to him, you bastard. How could you do this? But then realizes, oh, Danny told me a woman choked him, type of thing.
But that's the thing that's interesting, though, is that we go from when Jack's screaming and Wendy goes to comfort him, he's like, I had a horrible nightmare that I killed you and Danny.
Yeah, he has the nightmare. He says he does to his family what Grady did to the twins that he heard earlier in the movie. Yep.
Yes. And then we see, like you already mentioned, we see Danny come out. Wendy goes over and says, you did this to him. And it's like, well, what would lead her to believe that he hurt Danny? Because prior to this, the only other mention we have of Jack being violent to Danny is the one time he got drunk. Mm-hmm. But Wendy is very forgiving when she talks about that.
Yeah, I've always kind of been a little unsure of, is that true forgiving, or is that I'm trying to put a good family face on for this medical professional, where she might still have those bad feelings, be like, my husband might hurt our son. But when she's talking to this doctor who actually could, influence her family dynamic, where she's kind of like, oh, it's nothing. It just happens. It's okay. He walked into a door.
No. Let's see. I guess Danny started talking to Tony about the time we put him in nursery school.
Did he adjust well to school?
No. He didn't like it too much at first. And then he had an injury, so we kept him out for a while. And yeah, I guess that's about the time when I first noticed that he was talking to Tony.
What sort of injury did he have?
He dislocated his shoulder.
How did he manage to do that?
Well, it was just one of those things, purely an accident. My husband had been drinking, and he came home about 3 hours late. So he wasn't exactly in the greatest mood that night. And, Danny had scattered some of his school papers all over the room, and my husband grabbed his arm, to pull him away from him. It's just the sort of thing you do 100 times with a child, in the park or in the streets. But on this particular occasion, my husband just used too much strength, and he injured Danny's arm. Anyway, something good did come out of it all, because he said, Wendy, I'm never going to touch another drop. And if I do, you can leave me. And he didn't. And he hasn't had any alcohol in 5 months.
That type of thing. I've always been a little uncertain of that family dynamic with them.
He got hit with a baseball.
He closed his eyes when I whipped a fastball at his face. What can I say?
No, but I mean this more like in a scene syntax sort of way. You have the moment where all this is happening. She blames Jack, and then he goes off storming into the gold room as he starts talking to the imaginary bartender. And then Lloyd shows up and pours him the drink. And then he's having his conversation about Lloyd about how he hurt Danny that one time, but it was an accident.
Yeah.
And he does seem to be rather remorseful in that sequence. And then as that scene kind of like unfolds, Wendy runs in and says, "Jack, there's a crazy woman in room 237. She hurt Danny.
Yeah.
He told me." And he turns around.
Switches motif from being angry at him to just being like, "You need to help us now."
She's frantic, and he turns around and goes, "Are you out of your effing mind?"
Yeah.
And it's like, and so he goes in there, and at that point, again, the film goes to a point of view shot. As we walk into room 237. We do not see Jack until he starts to embrace the woman.
We don't even see like his hand on the doorway. It's all just camera and things moving, right?
It's very disembodied.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
That's what I'm thinking, because I do subscribe to the theory that, and I think in the most understandable way to put this is that this is kind of like I don't want to say an alternate reality, but it's parallel dimensions. It's all these things happening at once. Mm-hmm. Some maybe prioritized more than others in the sense of how they're occurring in time. But we see him walk in. And we do have the thing with the woman, though. But the thing I find fascinating, though, is that, yes, we have the beautiful woman, and clearly that's meant to be a jab. That nothing against Shelley Duvall, but Shelley Duvall is a very peculiar, odd-looking woman. I think that's fair to say, right? That's not mean, right?
I'm so glad this is coming up. I was trying to work this in near the start of our conversation, but it just didn't fit because we did so much Room 237. It doesn't come up a lot on this podcast. But there's a few women I absolutely love. I think the only two times it's come up on this podcast is Naomi Watts and fucking Rhonda Boussalat's eyes from that episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I love Shelley Duvall.
Whoa. Was it from Unsolved Mysteries or Real Scary Stories that you liked the woman with the pretty eyes?
That was Unsolved Mysteries, definitely.
Oh, okay. I know in the Real Scary Stories episode there was a woman with eyes that you really liked.
I think it was a voice in Unsolved Mysteries. In Real Scary Stories, it was the eyes. I'm pretty sure Rhonda Boussalat was Unsolved Mysteries. I have to go dig up those 12 pages of notes I have on Unsolved Mysteries.
Good.
Hey kids, Rhonda Boussalat was certainly from Unsolved Mysteries, but it was her beautiful, beautiful voice that I loved. While in Real Scary Stories from the segment called Condi's Ghost, it was Sarah's eyes that I also loved.
But I agree with you completely when you say Shelley Duvall is a peculiar person to look at. I just love everything about her. I've loved her in other things as well. I'm not just explicit to The Shining. I think she's great. That whole first scene that we were discussing where she's, telling the doctor, it's a thing that just happens to all families. He had school papers and Danny knocked him down. He grabbed him. It's just a little too hard. It's not that bad. But in that scene, she also smokes a cigarette. And
I forgot
knows
about that.
Oh, God, she's smoking cigarettes the whole movie. Oh, I love Shelley Duvall in this movie. And the way she talks as well is also great. And I think the point you're getting at with Shelley Duvall, sure, the woman in Room 237 is supposed to be much more glamorous to some extent than she is because she's dressed in the frumpiest fucking clothing the entire movie. But I think Shelley Duvall's character plays an important point, especially in the scene where Jack is freaking out at her and she has the baseball bat. When she first gets on the stairs before they start backing up and when she's just first swinging it at Jack Nicholson, she basically says something. Jack Nicholson's going, "Have you ever thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever spent one instance thinking about my responsibilities? You don't get anything I'm doing." And she goes, "I'm so confused." And I think that's...
Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
I'm very confused. I just need a chance to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. What good's a few minutes more gonna do you now?
Stay away from me. Please.
That's her point in this movie. She can't shine. She isn't experiencing these things the way that they do. But she is just this she is the regular man in this movie, to use that common phrase. She's the straight man. She's the one who doesn't know what's going on. And I just love her in every sense, every way, shape, and form. I could watch that scene, that close-up on her face describing Jack Nicholson dislocating Danny's shoulder. I could watch that on repeat. God, she's beautiful, man.
I think Rob watched Lamb Chop a little too much when he was a kid, and he was like, or no, it wasn't Lamb Chop. No. Wasn't it? Oh God, what was the thing she did on PBS when we were kids?
Are you talking about Wishbone? She was on an episode of Wishbone, I remember.
No, like back in the really early 90s, Shelley Duvall did a thing on, I'm saying PBS because that's how I remember it from. Shelley Duvall used to read like the children's stories on PBS. I forget, there was a name for it. It wasn't Lamb Chop.
I know. I think I know what you're talking about.
It's a thing. It exists. I'm not just making it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so going back to Room 237 and Rob's weird sort of like kink for Shelley Duvall.
Love me some Shelley Duvall.
Good, I'm glad. No, I think part of that things clearly the woman in the tub is meant to be the most, I think you put it well, the glamorous, more kind of like what a gorgeous woman in every sense of the word. And she's nude and she's getting out of a bathtub. She's dripping wet. But the thing that I think is fascinating is that is it her deteriorating into the old hag, or is it just because like those sequences, like it's clearly a decomposing corpse.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But why are we see? Because again, we see Jack, like he's embracing her, he's kissing the woman, and then we see like a close up of like behind her neck, and we see the skin getting like really kind of just like yucky and deteriorating, and then we get like the mirror shot, and then another mirror, and we see like he sees that she's like disintegrating, and then we see see her like it goes back to that like first person POV as she goes ha 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 ha, like she's like mummy walking at him.
Yep.
But then we keep cutting back to like the corpse like under the water of the bathtub, then coming out of the water of the bathtub, and then like the corpse like walking toward him. We never see the old hag walking toward him and Jack in the same frame. We never see that.
Oh, okay. And
I just want again, I'm not trying to point say I have some big point for all this. I'm just pointing out things that seem irregular to me.
Gotcha. Sure, yeah.
And I just feel like even though like the people, like it's funny, I think the crazy people in the Room 237 film, I agree with them in kind of the symptom that like the Room 237 sequence is something to note, like to kind of note and pay attention to. I just kind of disagree with the diagnosis of it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
That's how I see it. Because I do think there's a lot of weird stuff. Because even after that whole thing happens, Wendy finds Jack and she's like, "So what happened?" And he's like, "Nothing at all."
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think is so weird. That like, oh, Jack is experiencing this thing, and yet he doesn't have any. He doesn't really. I don't want to say confide, but he has no need to bring it up to anybody.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting. Absolutely. I guess I've always kind of thought of that as. That's where his descent into madness kind of comes from. It's the age-old saying of crazy people don't think they're going crazy. And, there's no reason for them to talk about it, if they think that something's starting to slip. Because I think that's where everywhere earlier in the movie, prior to Jack Nicholson going into Room 237, he's just pissed off at his family. It's just the whole thing of kind of like, what the hell's going on? Like, let me do my work. He's losing his grip on reality. And then I think the Room 237 thing is, because he's freaked out by that old corpse, that old hag that laughs at him. And that might be the first time where he's realizing, well, something's not right in my head. I don't need to tell that to anybody because that's almost human nature, It's like, it's like you spend 5 minutes talking to someone who's not there. You're not going to go, "Oh man, guess what I did yesterday," to anybody. People are going to be like, "You should get checked out after that," type of thing.
It makes you wonder about like Jack and his whole like his ability to shine, because he has the confidence. Because I would say Lloyd is the first quote unquote supernatural thing that happens in the entire film.
Definitely. Yep.
And yet Jack isn't surprised by any of that. So is it fair to assume that he's encountered this before, where he's talked to people from this other dimension, or it's just he's been doing this for so long that he just can't tell the difference?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But I think of it as that unstuck in time. Like that's when he's starting to realize he's done this all before. Maybe not in him and his memories, but it's starting to come forward where it's like, he's like, "You're the best bartender. Glad to see you again," that type of thing. And then with Grady later on, he's like, "You've always been the caretaker." It's like that slow realization that maybe, he's experienced all of this. And even at the start, when Shelley Duvall brings him breakfast in bed and he's like, oh man, like every corner we would turn, it's like I've been here before and I knew where we were going. And it's like that. I've always taken that as that slight inkling that he's starting to realize what's going on a grander scale, and starts to be influenced by it in a negative way. Where, you know, Grady's like, you got to stop your son from bringing people from the outside. You got to fix these problems because we live in this little bubble that just moves against the rules of the rest of the world, and we got to keep it that way. And he's the one who wants to kind of keep it that way, where Danny, who can also shine, is the one who's kind of like, Dad, will you ever hurt us? You wouldn't do that, right? We're going to make it out of here type of thing. So kind of like two sides of the same coin, one supporting, one negating almost.
Yes, but then it comes down to like the whole thing with Scatman Crothers is that if he can shine and the hotel doesn't like outsiders coming in, then why is Scatman Crothers been there for so many years? Why?
That hit me on this viewing, that the whole fact that he's in Miami for a bit and has to take a plane to get back to them. That definitely, you know, in this viewing threw a wrench in the works.
Well, I get this. Well, that's the thing too, is that you do need that superficial element. And I don't mean, and when I say superficial, I'm not using that in a negative connotation. I'm just saying you need the idea of like, oh, the cavalry's coming, Scatman Crothers, Dick Halloran, he's going to save Danny and Wendy. Like, I get that. You need that for the normies in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Or you need that for the commercial aspects of the film. But it's the idea that like, oh, when you dig deeper into this film, if the whole thing with the hotel is aware of like what's going to happen, why isn't it why is it allowing Dick Halloran at any time then? And that also makes you wonder how much of this is Ullman and Bill Watson.
Yeah, that's what I was about to bring up. You know, I feel like there's so much of the actual workings of the hotel during the on season that we don't know about that would or might provide insight into these theories.
Yeah, and that's why that's the thing that like this is where you wish you could sit down with somebody who was making this film and been like, okay, when like you talk to like, I don't know, the production designer. So when Kubrick had you put a window here, despite the fact that there shouldn't be a window here, like, did you ask him like, this doesn't make any sense, or did you just go with the flow?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's where you'd love to talk to somebody who was on the set for that film. Be like, did Jack Nicholson ever bring up the fact that this window shouldn't have been here?
Yeah, did anybody? Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I mean.
And what would Kubrick have said? You know, would he have pulled a Michael Bay and just said "fuck you, keep filming," or would he have tried to explain it to people? Who knows?
Because again, I think everybody kept like Kubrick in high like regards. Like most people wouldn't have questioned him, but someone like Jack Nicholson, who's like a superstar to end all superstars at this time, could have gotten away with asking it. And been like, Stanley, what's up with the window? Or like you know what? I don't think the sun peers through the window this time of the day. Like Jack Nicholson's someone who could have had the same level of clout, if not more, who could have gotten away with asking some of these questions, not for just like easy answers. I'm not saying, again, nobody's looking for easy answers. It's been like, Stanley, what is this trying to convey to the audience? Like, what do you want the audience to take away from this? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that like you have all these like people being interviewed. Like, again, they found the film editor who went around like on a Saturday afternoon and edited all the prints to take out the Ullman like hospital scene.
Yeah.
Yet nobody found a production designer and said, hey, Did anybody on set ever have a conversation about this? Not even if it wasn't even to Kubrick. Did anybody just kind of like sit down during like lunch and been like,
what are we doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did anybody ever ask these questions? Like that must have come. Again, I get it's a movie set. Things are constantly happening. People don't really sit on their butt and like ask philosophical questions. They're more concerned about like getting the shot and like getting their jobs like a day's worth of work done. Even in editing, did the editor come in just like, that's what I mean. Nobody is like contacting the people that matter.
Yeah, that's a good point. That would be a good source of information, absolutely. Even if, you know, I think Michael Bay is one extreme of, you know, the fuck you thing is the famous story from Armageddon, where Ben Affleck was like, why are we sending drillers into space? Shouldn't we just train astronauts to drill? And Michael Bay was like, fuck you, film the damn scene. But the other side of the spectrum, which I would imagine Kubrick was more like, is, you know, I've seen maybe a minute or two ever of Kubrick behind the scenes stuff. But I'm thinking of like David Lynch, the behind-the-scenes features for Twin Peaks Season 3. I've watched those, and there's some instances where Kyle MacLachlan or Richard Horn, Jerry Horn, whatever that actor's name is, the guy from The Warriors, he would ask David Lynch, like, you know, what's my motivation? What am I doing in this scene? And David Lynch would speak for like 7 minutes straight, and it's like me as the audience member watching it and the actor you can see are both like, okay, did you answer my question? And I feel like that's what Kubrick might have given, where if someone was like, what's the deal with this window, Stanley? And he goes on some, 5-minute explanation that to him answers the question, but to no one else, it does not. So I don't know. But what I'm saying is, even if that was the case, it would be great to hear from these people that got those answers and can relay them to us, because maybe there is some nugget of knowledge in there that people can, latch onto and expand from.
But, okay, two things. By the time David Lynch was making Twin Peaks: The Return, everybody who's ever heard the name David Lynch know how like surreal he is, and just
sure. So they were expecting of that working environment.
Yeah, if you were to ask David Lynch today about anything going on, like I would expect that as an answer.
You're going to be like, okay, that is words, but I need to think about what to make of them, type of thing.
And I think David Lynch knows too that like if he does one of those responses, most people will go away. I think he knows that if he throws some like token philosophy at somebody, they'll go away and be like, okay, then. Okay. But there's a thing in the Stanley Kubrick, A Life in Pictures documentary where he talks. Stanley Kubrick was a big like animal lover. He had tons of cats. He had some dogs, and I forget. I think it was one of his daughters that said during the film shoot of Barry Lyndon, where he was on like location and he wasn't like at his estate with all of his animals, he left like 35 pages of notes on how to take care of like the animals.
Okay.
And if maybe I have time and I can find it, I'll insert the clip here. But his daughter is reading the instructions. He left like a page worth of instructions, and she reads from it about two of the cats. Like I'm just making up their names now. Like one of them's like Jerry, the other one's Freddie, and they were a father and son like cats. And he goes into instructions that if they're fighting, you have to sit there, throw a bucket of water on them. You can also leave a door open, but only if Freddie can get out. Because if Jerry gets out ahead of him, he'll never be able to get away. But if that doesn't work, it just keeps going on and on, like all these contingencies.
Sure.
For like if these two specific cats out of like a dozen plus start fighting, what you should do. And it eventually concludes with if you can't do any of the following, just keep throwing buckets of water, jumping up and down, shaking boxes, throwing towels until eventually they stop.
Stanley would involve himself, to such an extent with the detail of stuff that one thought perhaps was a bit beneath him. He should have been doing major stuff and not worrying about how you had certain files in your office. I guess Stanley saw it all as a package deal. You either cared or you didn't care.
When we went to Ireland on Barry Lyndon, he left this 15-page document, care instructions for how to look after the animals. And the 37th instruction is, if a fight should develop between Freddie and Leo, and that was a father and son tomcats that we had, the only way that you can do anything about it is to dump water on them. Try to grab Freddie and run out of the room with him. Do not try and pick up Leo. Alternatively, if you open a door and just let Freddie get out, he can outrun Leo. But if he's trapped in a place where you can't separate them, just keep dumping water, shouting, screaming, jumping up and down and distracting him, waving shirts, towels. Just try and get them apart and grab Freddie.
I remember once he had a cat that was drinking excessively, and I said, well, perhaps you can measure how much that cat's drinking, Stanley. And he said, no, that's impossible. There are too many cats. And then he phoned back a couple of minutes later and he said, but I could count the number of laps. And he then said, now how much does each lap take up in terms of water? I said, I don't think there's any information on that. He said, well, leave it with me. I'll try and find out. And he'd go off and he'd try and find out from somewhere, and then he'd work it out and we'd have a figure. He was compulsive in that sort of way.
This is a man that's literally thought of everything.
Yes.
Yet somehow there's like these weird question marks that it's just not that not again, like you said, everything is, I think we've made it loud and clear that everything is done on purpose, but there are these things in here where it's like he's not a surrealist like David Lynch. He's not like Stanley Kubrick was never avant-garde. Mm-hmm. Like he made you think, but it wasn't like Twin Peaks: The Return season 8 where it's like, oh good Lord, what? It's like I didn't know my drink was spiked when I started watching this. Yeah. Everything Kubrick did was like rooted in logic. He didn't just have weird imagery for the sake of weird imagery. He doesn't have David Bowie as a giant tea kettle because, David Bowie died during the shooting of this. Like when you have a bear man performing a blowjob to a man in a suit, in Kubrick's mind, that had a purpose.
Yep, absolutely.
There's a reason why. Think about it. That is one of the more low-key, iconic horror sequences of all time. Yet to this day, no one's figured out what that scene means.
Yeah, that was when I watched, because I watched Room 237 2 days ago, The Shining yesterday. And after watching The Shining, I was kind of like, why did this scene not come up in Room 237?
Yeah, that's what I think it means. So it's like, and yes, Room 230. I don't think Room 237 is meant to be like a comprehensive documentary explaining everything in The Shining, because that would be a never-ending film. But it's the idea that there are so many things in this film that are inexplicable, coming from a man that rooted everything he did in logic and reason.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
But that's what makes me wonder, if everything Kubrick did was rooted in logic and reasoning, what was going on in the Ullman hospital sequence that conflicted with his reasoning? That's what I mean. Anytime somebody a filmmaker that has that puts that much thought into anything they do, cuts something, especially in a way that requires an insane amount of effort to rectify, it must be something pretty significant.
Yeah, you would definitely think so, and I agree with you completely.
And that's why I'm starting to think that there is more to this. Clearly there's more to this. I think that's been made abundantly clear. But it's just that I feel like there's some, much like The Shining, and there's multiple, layers of existence happening in the hotel. I feel like there's a layer or two, or maybe even more, of this film that nobody has even cracked yet. And I do think the key to it, or at least maybe just a slightly higher enlightenment of it all, comes from what Kubrick cut out of it.
Yeah, could be.
But yes, that's yeah. Like I said, I that's the fun thing about The Shining is that, and I think going back to my presentation from college, how I concluded that in my presentation, I said Kubrick essentially made these films, I don't want to say difficult to decipher, not because he wanted to be a smartass and prove that he was better than everybody else. I think he did it because he knew that the films would have staying power.
Okay.
He knew that, I'm making The Shining in 1978, 79 for release in 1980.
Yeah.
Kubrick must have seen something. Again, we knew Kubrick was heavily influenced by Eraserhead. And someone like Kubrick probably would have watched that and said, wow, this guy's onto something. And he sees things like that, and Lord knows what Kubrick was watching. That's where you really wish somebody I know Steven Spielberg has all these personal anecdotes that he had when he talked to Stanley Kubrick over the years.
Yeah.
And I really wish even though those anecdotes are great, I wish Spielberg would be what was Kubrick watching when you were talking to him? Did he ever mention what he was watching or what he was thinking about? Kind of that I don't want to say superfluous information, but kind of the stuff that you wouldn't think would be important, but would give us more insights into what he was doing at that specific point in his life.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great to know.
Yeah. And that's why I wonder is that maybe that was Kubrick's ultimate sleight of hand when it came to his films. Full Metal Jacket comes out in 1987, and by that time you have Apocalypse Now, Platoon. Again, there's a bunch of others that I'm forgetting right off the top of my head. You have all these other Vietnam War films that are considered much better than Full Metal Jacket, except for maybe the boot camp. The boot camp thing really is that there'll never be a greater boot camp sequence filmed in cinematic history. You're never going to outdo boot camp and Full Metal Jacket.
Sure.
But when you're talking about the Vietnam War sequences, you do have things to outclass it, like Platoon and Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
But I wonder if Kubrick's master stroke was he knew by making his films in a way that was hard to decipher, they would live longer.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, and I think the same has been said and can be said for a lot of the things that exist today that were created however many years ago. People latch onto them and they have staying power because they are intriguing to some extent. The Shining is a great example. Like we said, Finnegan's Wake is a great example, which was 50 years before The Shining, or 40 years before The Shining, and that still stays around because nobody has any idea what to make of it. I think that's just the staying power of media, that when it hits people and causes this intrigue, they're going to latch onto it. Maybe not as a whole. Maybe some people fall away from it, but there's always going to be that little kind of sect, that niche corner of the media, the consumers of the media, that are always going to love it and keep pushing it forward. That's an interesting idea, to have that foresight for Stanley Kubrick. I think that's the most amazing thing, to, be able to do something like that, because especially in the day and age we live in, people are like, the Marvel movies, once again, the movie doesn't matter. They just want you to see the movie when it comes out and then buy it again when it's on Blu-ray. That's it. They don't care if it has staying power. To have that foresight back in the 70s and 80s to be like, let me do something that will stay with humanity, that's grand. And I can only hope that that's really part of what his thought process actually was. That's great.
Yeah, I think it was the idea of like lose the battle, win the war. It's the idea that like, you know what? And I don't think okay, that's not maybe the most apt comparison, but I do think it's the idea that like, okay, my films might not register now, and I think that happens with like you look at any of Kubrick's films when they were released. 2001 really critically was not applauded film. Pretty much every single one of his films was, I don't want to say it got like they usually got mixed reviews when they came out. Every single one of his films, and it wasn't until years later that people would go back and go, "Wow!" And that's kind of like any good film. Like, and everybody, if any of you listen to the Star Wars podcast, it's why I keep saying with like The Last Jedi, it's like we all hate The Last Jedi now, and guess what? 20 years from now, we ain't gonna hate The Last Jedi. We're all gonna look back and say, "Oh, this is exactly what we needed in this specific time." It's like, as much as we all hate Ruin Johnson, it's going to be this man understood the language of cinema, not just now, but in the future, and said, okay, people are going to, this is the film that we need, but nobody's aware of it.
Yeah. And that's something only the test of time will truly tell us.
Yeah. And I think that's how you call it. It's staying power. It's like, just because your movie made all the money in the world, like that's the joke with Avatar. Avatar made all the money in the world, but really nobody cares about it. Yeah, but that's what's interesting, though.
Those sequels, though, they're gonna break the universe.
If we ever, at this point, I think it's a very real possibility we'll figure out the meaning of The Shining before we get Avatar 2.
If anybody lives long enough.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be in room 237 with Jack and the naked, decaying hag, and we'll be like, there's still, even in this dimension, there's no Avatar 2.
I was gonna say that after the nukes go off, the only thing surviving were gonna be the roaches and Jimmy C.
All right, Rob, before we delve into our cinemoddies and late night questions and snack, is there anything else you wanted to highlight about The Shining or Room 237? Because I want time to devote to the Dr. Sleep trailer.
Okay, yeah. I do want to talk about the Dr. Sleep thing with you because I think we both have some strong opinions. I mentioned it earlier on. I do want to give a shout out. Something, as I said, I've been familiar with The Shining for a while now. The scene where the door gets unlatched for Jack Torrance, the supernatural aspect we were discussing, that scene has always stuck out to me because it's so strange and it's so, it gives you that sense of inquisitiveness. What just happened? How did that door get opened? And of course, we've discussed our theories about it, but there's something in another piece of media that I have to highlight, and Zach has not seen it, but ever since it came out and I watched it, the night it aired, it always made me think of The Shining. Are you ready for this, Zach? Go get a sandwich or something, because it's about Adventure Time. The first miniseries of Adventure Time was called Stakes. It was about Marceline the Vampire Queen, her whole history. When she gets her vampire aspects removed by Princess Bubblegum, it unleashes the vampires that she, suck the souls from, and they're back in the world, and she has to stop them again. And there's one episode, I know we've referenced it on this podcast before, where they have to stop the Moon. And the Moon is a nocturnal vampire who has a very, very meek appearance, but a crazy voice, like a crazy deep, like, I am the light that follows you when you are in the darkness, that type of thing.
Hey, we're leading you to a trap. We're gonna suck out your healing power and dust you. And then I'm gonna put your dust in a litter box. And get a tiger to drop a huge smelly tiger bomb on your sorry dust globs! Stop hitting my butt!
You run in the path of my light.
That's her voice?
How can you lead me when I am your guide?
Are you being literal or allegorical? Me no light! Run, Jake, run! But she said I'm running in her light! Who gives a dog? Just go!
And in the final showdown, because Marceline, the moon has regenerative powers. And when Marceline doesn't have that, it's a big deal. Like, if she gets hurt, she gets hurt. She can't heal herself like Wolverine. And in the final showdown, basically Princess Bubblegum and Marceline are locked in a pantry, and the moon is coming closer to them, and Finn and Jake are trying to hold her off. But Finn and Jake can't hold her off. The moon gets to the pantry door. She realizes that it's locked, and she starts screaming at the lock, "Open it! Open it, pigs! You pigs! Open it!" And it devolves into, like, we get the scene of inside the pantry with Marceline and Princess Bubblegum talking to each other. And in the background, you just hear the moon going, "Pigs! Pigs! Pigs! Pigs!"
It's locked, Dipstick! Come on, Marcy! Wake up! Wake up!
And then the scene cuts to a flashback for Marceline, which is the whole point of the miniseries, her story and stuff like that. But when it cuts back to the episode, you still hear pigs, pigs. And there's an inside shot very much like of Jack Torrance, of Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, and you just hear the door opening. You hear the latch open. And, of course, it's locked from the inside. They're protecting themselves, opposite of Jack Torrance. So there's no way to open this door from the outside, but it opens. And there's one line where Princess Bubblegum just looks at the moon and goes, "Did you just scream pigs at the lock until it opened?" And they never mention it again.
Wake up! Huh? You! Marceline! Did you just yell pigs at the lock until it opened?
And I've always thought that was a Shining reference, because it's shot in a very similar, like, kind of way where, we see Jack kind of on his right side, or the camera's on his right side. The door opens and you kind of just, it goes from there. And I've always loved that because there's no answer. In Adventure Time, there's no answer. How did that lock get opened? As far as we know, a vampire screamed the word pigs at it until it opened. Same thing with The Shining. Nobody really knows how that door got opened. You have to have theories about it. And I had to make that connection because that's one of my favorite scenes in Adventure Time, where Princess Bubblegum, the scientific mind, is once again blown away by the fact that something happened that she can't explain. And also, when that drops, when I watch it, did you scream pigs at a lock until it opened? Hilarious. So I once again, Shining has been homaged and referenced in a million things. I have no definitive knowledge if that's what they were going for in Stakes, the vampire kind of horror-esque Adventure Time thing, but it's always gotten that connection for me, where they wrote in kind of something gets opened in an unexplained way and they keep it ambiguous. I love it.
What was the quote that Rob made up about me? God, I feel like this podcast, we're going jumping forth. In the Knights of Vader recording last Rob was on, we talked about more Star Wars, Clone Wars episodes and Rebels. Rob misquoted me about, what was it, Breaking Bad? And he's like, Zach said once that if you cut, I didn't care what I see, and I don't care if I ever see it again. I didn't say that about Breaking Bad. I said I don't see anything that I dislike, and I'd probably watch more of the show if I had to.
That was Breaking Bad?
That was Breaking Bad.
Oh, so it was Adventure Time.
Yes, it was Adventure Time where I said, you know what? I had my fill of this. I'm good.
I think I repressed it because I just don't want anybody to say that about Adventure Time. Okay. But okay.
Do we ever get going back to the Adventure Time finale episode, which is like a year old now. Did we ever get a spinoff with like Fufu, the little thing and the giant like dog? Do you ever
Shermie and Beth?
Yeah, Shermie and Beth. Do we ever get a spinoff with like a comic book or something?
No, they have not appeared in the comics as far as I know. The current comic book storyline is, I think they're still looking for Marceline's father, who's basically the devil in Adventure Time. He's missing for some reason. The major arc of the comics is Simon trying to free Betty.
Oh, okay.
or Ice King trying to, well, he's not Ice King anymore, but, you know, Simon trying to free Betty. Because that's what the last bit of Adventure Time was, Betty freeing Simon. But guess what? It's never going to end. Nobody should be happy in good movies and TV shows.
Oh, good, folks. See, folks, we're going to have another 3-hour-long episode, and we're going to devote part of it to Adventure Time. All right, Rob, do we want to do Snack, Cinemati, and Late Night Stats and Snack, then delve into Dr. Sleep, or should we do Dr. Sleep first?
I'm that's an interesting idea. I'd be good with doing Dr. Sleep afterwards, because after we do our real questions, it would go down to me asking you if we know what we're doing next week, and spoiler alert, we don't. So maybe we need to fill that little bit. But I think you have more to say about Dr. Sleep than I do, so I could do it afterwards, but I'll leave that up to you.
All right, let's do it afterwards. Let's do something. Let's throw it up. Let's do something a little bit different. We'll break our norm.
Okay.
All right, Rob.
We're trying to make people actually listen to this part of the podcast.
Sure. And people usually just turn off at this point. They say, "Okay, I'll see you next week, Rob and Zach." All right, Rob. The Shining and Room 237, Cinemati, and or Late Night Movie. And you can separate them. It's not like a bundle deal. You don't need to
God. Oh God, I thought we were grouping them. Room 237, definitely not a cinematity to me. To me, it comes off as a YouTube video. Like, people had ideas, and yes, it's well done. Don't get me wrong. It's a well done documentary, in air quotes, if that's what we can call it. It's a well done story, but that doesn't scream anything other to me than, you know, hey, I got my friends. We have some weird ideas. Here's a YouTube video about it. Late Night, I think I'm kind of on the yes side for Room 237 as well as The Shining, but something like an if-else statement. Like, if you have a late night movie opportunity and you are seeing and you're thinking about watching The Shining and it's someone who really knows The Shining, or maybe not knows it in the sense of, you know, Zach did his presentation or has seen Room 237, but has seen the movie and is familiar with it, then you show them Room 237. If they've never seen The Shining, then you start with that. As far as The Shining for cinematity, I'm going to say yes. It's just a yes. I don't think there's any caveat. This is yes. This movie is so strange to me. It enthralls me so much. It does it unlike any other film I think I've seen, or very few other films. So I'm going to go yes. So yes to cinematities for Shining. No to Room 237. Fuck, how do I split cells in an Excel document? And then yes to Late Night for both, but you have that kind of checks, that if-else statement. If they've seen The Shining, you show them Room 237. If they haven't, you watch The Shining. That's what I'm thinking.
All right. Shining, yes, for both. Definitely. I remember once I put this was, I think, maybe last year. I put The Shining on and like I fell asleep and I woke up right in like the Room 237 part and it kind of like freaked me out a little. And I'm like, well, this works.
I thought you were going to say you woke up and there was someone with a bear costume sexually assaulting you.
Well, that happens when I'm not watching The Shining. That's the one time I know it won't happen. But no, definite cinemati, late night movie. Room 237, I completely disagree with Rob on the cinemati part. I think this is like a bold new way of, I think it's quite the opposite of the YouTube video because there's too much finesse going into the clips with all the superimposing and just a way of like creating reenactments of people based on like footage of like other stuff. A lot of
I'll give you
creativity
that.
went to this.
I should clarify, it's a good YouTube. It's a better YouTube video.
No. If you see the good stuff on YouTube, anybody can make a YouTube video if you have access to like a pirated version of like Adobe like Premiere. Like no, anybody can do that. This required some effort and some creativity that most of the people on YouTube don't have. Definite cinemati, late night movie, how Rob kind of framed it for Room 237. I would say if somebody has not seen The Shining in a while, but definitely, I can't imagine showing Room 237 to someone who's never seen The Shining. But if most people have seen The Shining at some point in their lives, but probably don't remember it that much or have like an encyclopedic knowledge of it, I would say that's the ideal kind of like, oh God, stage for this. Somebody who has not seen The Shining in a while, you show them this, and then you show them The Shining is like a double feature. Late night double feature. I think Room 237 accompanied by The Shining.
Okay, so you can spend 4 hours on those two or 4 hours on our Jurassic World episode.
No, Rob. 4 hours on our Ted Bundy episode.
Perfect. Yes, for Monstober, yes.
As the Lord intended it.
See, it's interesting. The double feature idea I like and I agree with. It's just, I think what was the order you said? But it depends on how recently they've seen it. Because I agree with you. You can't say, "Oh, have you ever seen The Shining?" And they say no. You can't say, "Okay, we're going to watch this documentary on it, so I can bias your brain before you see it." I would rather, of course, do it the other way around. But you're saying you would show them 237 first if they hadn't seen The Shining in a while?
Well, I would say anybody who's not aware of the film Room 237. I would show them that if they've seen The Shining. They could have seen The Shining a week ago, a month, a year, a decade ago. As long as they have as long as they've seen The Shining in its entirety at some point in their lives, I think that's the catalyst. I think enough. I like it. I think Room 237 is a fantastic appetizer for The Shining, because I think it really gets the juices flowing. It stimulates the mind, and it has you go into The Shining much more mentally alert, as opposed to just, I'm gonna watch this scary, spooky movie.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that clarifies or brings to light exactly what I should have said. It's not a cinemodity. Zach and I are split once again. But late night, Room 237 is exactly the type of thing that I'm looking for to cause that discussion with a late night movie, because I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that has seen The Shining, knows about Stanley Kubrick, and then you show them this. You're going to have a great discourse with that person about if the moon landing was fake or not. And that's great discussion. Maybe it's not about that. Maybe it's more about the genocide of the Native Americans or the Holocaust. I think that's exactly why this is a late night movie. It would work well as a late night movie for the people that have seen The Shining, because you're going to get that discussion and intrigue and exposition from it. So yeah, absolutely.
All right, Rob, snack.
Yeah.
All right, I'll get mine out of the way because mine's the easiest one. I want a Sunnyside eggs where you have to dip the bacon into the yolk.
Are you saying you only have one snack? Is that what you're saying?
Well, this isn't really a snack-heavy movie.
I found many snacks from The Shining.
I bet you did, because I know you got the pantry, you got the meat freezer, and I guess the only thing I could say is that maybe we have a copy of Playgirl hanging around the restaurant. Maybe that. Maybe.
That's like not the bathroom material. That's like the waiting area material.
Sure.
When you get the buzzer that you have to wait to go off for your table to be ready, there's just Playgirls going around.
There you go.
So I'm glad you brought up breakfast, because the breakfast food, the toast that you have to dip in the eggs, is what you said?
Yes. No, not toast. It's bacon. It's bacon.
Yes, bacon. Sorry. So that's from the scene where Shelley Duvall brings Jack Nicholson breakfast in bed, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So I saw that same scene, but when I saw that they were just eating regular old breakfast food, no. That's not enough for me. I agree with you that we could have that, but I think I'm going to expand on what you said, Zach. The Cinemodities Breakfast Nook. Oh. It's a special location in the restaurant, because I think I'm just getting very, amusement park oriented, that we have different lands for different things. Because we got the wedding ceremony area, we got the Vox Lux area, we got the laser tag area, we got the Cine-Modities area, which is the kids section. So I'm thinking about a Cinemodities Breakfast Nook. And maybe it's like, if you want breakfast food, this is where you would go, type of thing. And the only caveat I have on the Cinemodities Breakfast Nook, it's not weird, it's not crazy. I'm actually drawing on something that I think a lot of breakfast nooks and restaurants and hotels do. But it's a part of the restaurant where we charge insanely expensive prices for cheap and terrible breakfast foods. Because every fucking hotel and restaurant I've ever goddamn been to sucks with their breakfast food. And it's like $18 for a cranberry juice that's been sitting out overnight. So why don't we do that also? Because other people seem to love it. People fucking have no problem spending $25 on a cold eggs Benedict. Why can't we make some of that money?
Fuck you, the nickel. You know what you did.
So that's what I was thinking. The Cinemodities Breakfast Nook. I'm glad you picked up on that as well. We need somewhere where we can, really gouge the prices up for some cheap stuff.
I like it, but I think I have another idea. Much like we have the wedding pavilion, why don't we annex the Overlook Hotel? We have the Cinemodities Hotel, the Overlook. We have a hotel on the premises now.
Oh, that's a good idea, Zach. That's a good idea, absolutely. Oh, God.
With the impossible windows, too. The TVs don't have cords.
I'm just imagining like you go to the go to get your reservation for the hotel. You know, go to like the not the concierge, but the bellhop. You know, the check-in desk, whatever that's formally called. And you know, it's one of those shady ones like you see in Law and Order, where they're like, you go up and it's like, do you know where I can get some company for the night? And it's like, oh yes, and it's like all that shady prostitute stuff. But you know, anybody that actually wants that, they're gonna get a dude in a bear costume in their room.
You pay by it's like, oh, I'd like to stay in room 237, please. And it's like, that'll be $40. Wow, for one night? No, for the hour.
What do you think about every room in the Cinema Oddities Hotel is either numbered 237 or 1408?
Oh, God. That 1408 movie, I haven't seen that in a while.
I've only seen bits and pieces of the movie, but I know the short story, so...
Yeah, I remember that movie. God, I haven't seen that movie like in 10 plus years. I don't even remember liking it. I just remember watching it. You ever had that before? You've watched something, but you have no opinion on it whatsoever?
Oh, yeah. I think I felt the same way about what I did see. I think I started it and fell asleep or something like that. But yeah, I think, just get some, or 237, 217, and 1408. Just get all the Stephen King room numbers in there.
Oh, boy.
I like it. That's something we're going to have to detail a little further, the hotel, as we think about it for sure. But I mean, yeah, we would need a hotel, because if people get too messed up on, you know, their bump of Coke or what other poisons they're ingesting in their meals, you know, they can't drive home after that. We're a safe restaurant. We take their keys before they're drunk. We take their keys when they walk through the door.
Oh boy!
It's the Ferris Bueller thing where our valets are just going on joyrides constantly.
Oh boy!
Okay, so breakfast nook. I love that. Yes.
That's it?
No, I got more. Zach.
God.
Inspired by the scene at the beginning where Dick Halloran is showing Wendy and Danny around the kitchen, and when he's in the storage closet, he goes on that great rant where he's like, we got dried peaches, we got dried apricots, we got meats, we got cheeses. And while he's ranting all these things off to Wendy, there's that scene where Danny Danny looking at Dick Halloran, but the camera zooms in and Dick Halloran looks at him and, like, you know, through The Shining, telepathically, he's like, wouldn't you like some ice cream, Doc? Or something like that. We need a way for our waiters to telepathically communicate with customers, but the customers don't know about it. So this is what I mean, Zach. I want our waiters to have the ability where when they're listing off specials, or, you know, they're going through a list that they have to give to customers, since they're waiters in this restaurant, they can telepathically curse at the customers. I want, and the customers can hear it, but they're not going to know. Like I said before, when you realize you're going crazy, the first response isn't, whoa, everybody, did you know I just heard something? Did you hear anything else? Nobody's going to do that. So I'm thinking if we do it sparsely enough, you know, one of our waiters is going to be listing through specials, and then the customer is going to be listening attentively, and it'll be something like, and we have the country fried steak, and then telepathically, get that, you fat fuck. And the customer is going to be like, what? What? So I want that, but that's our no liability way for our waiters to be mean to customers. Because you can't prove it. You can't prove it. There's no police report about telepathic incidents. We're good. No liability. What do you think?
I think it's another subline of the Cinema Oddities restaurant. No liability.
No liability. I'm always thinking about that. Absolutely. The last two I think I have are actual foods. So one of them, I think they're both pretty easy. Red rum. Red rum. I want to serve rum that is just rum, but we have colored it red through the distillation process. Maybe we're making this rum in-house. Maybe we're just getting cheap rum and coloring it red, but red rum. Easy enough, right?
Sure.
Okay, and the last one I have is a food, but it's also an activity. Zach, you're familiar with a profiterole, right?
I am not.
Okay, profiterole is a puff pastry, basically, like a little puff pastry, and it's got some cream in it or something like that. Profiteroles are good if you like, you know, sweets and puff pastries. There's a thing called a croquembouche. So a croquembouche is a tower of profiteroles. It's basically like a big pyramid, or rounded pyramid, so tower, of profiteroles. Like hundreds of profiteroles you can get in a croquembouche. Like it's a huge party food. So this is my thought. We have kind of something you can order or something you can go to in the restaurant, and we make a croquembouche, but it's not in the shape of a tower. It's in the shape of a door. And if you're not familiar with croquembouche, what you do is you make like hundreds of profiteroles, and then you make a caramel sauce, and the caramel sauce is like the glue that keeps the tower together. We do the same thing, but we build a door or a wall-shaped thing, and we let the customer hack through it with an axe. And then when they're done, they can eat those profiteroles type of thing. And I think that's a good way, you know, just to combine the famous scene from this movie with a good dessert, with excess, which we love in the Cinemati's restaurant, because you'd need probably thousands of profiteroles to make a door big enough that you could hack an axe through. But it's also fun. It's entertaining to our customers. It's almost like I was thinking about it as the piñata of the Cinemati's restaurant. And, you know, of course, I also think that we should kick people out if they use the axe to break down this door, and if they say, "Here's Johnny," we boot them. We just
good.
We boot them. We take their credit card and then boot them.
No bump of coke for you.
No bump of coke. No freak DVD. No bump of coke. No liability.
No liability.
So what do you think? I thought that would be cool. Like if we have a wall of pastries that you can hack through. Like I would do that for sure. I would give it a shot.
You could also do some sort of like, oh good lord, like like the sugar glass too.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, anything that, you know, we can kind of, you know, solidify to some extent, but still make it easy enough to break through. Yeah, I dig it.
Cool beans.
That was the last one I had. So we got some rum, we got some desserts, we got some no liability. I'm ready for Dr. Sleep.
Dr. Sleep, for those of you who might not know, Stephen King, and supposedly he doesn't do drugs anymore, but in September of 2013, Stephen King published a follow-up to The Shining titled Dr. Sleep, where apparently something, a bunch of stupid stuff happens with Danny. Who the hell cares? But what happens apparently is that, I don't even know how to describe this. They're making a movie on it, and when I first heard about this, I'm like, oh, like, of course, they're getting like a follow-up, a follow-up to The Shining being adapted into a movie. Why not? I heard like Ewan McDonald was in the movie, and I'm like, that's not Danny Torrance, but whatever. He's a name, and I would imagine he's not too expensive. So like a couple of weeks, like maybe a couple months ago, like a trailer debuted for it, and I was like I had like a ton like of Stanley Kubrick Shining like scenes in it,
yeah,
and I'm like, why are they doing this? I'm like, Stephen King hates the Stanley Kubrick film.
Yep.
And B, it's like, are they just, and really how I thought of it was like, oh, they're just like tying it into it. Like they're just like showing like familiar images so they hook you with like nostalgia. And I'm like, that's a really cheap marketing angle, but fine. Whatever it takes to get butts in the seats, I'm on board with.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of weeks ago, I remember like seeing online that like a final trailer was released. I didn't watch it because I really didn't care. And then like an hour before recording this episode, I found it and I'm watching it. And I was appalled to see that they are in certain sequences literally recreating shots from the previous film.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not from the Stanley Kubrick film.
Yeah.
And I'm like, after everything we've said about this like movie and how much weight and how much just significance there is in everything in it, imagine having the audacity and nerve to try to recreate it to sell a new product.
Yeah, exactly.
And the thing that makes me wonder about this, because, like, folks, if you haven't already, like, by the time this goes out, I think the movie will come out, like, in a week or so, or maybe 2 weeks. Like, this trailer, like, if you know anything about The Shining, you look at this trailer and be like, I can't believe they're doing this.
That's like, exactly when I watched it, you know, right before we started talking to each other. That's exactly my response. I can't believe they're doing this.
Yeah, it's just
nobody wants this.
Well, I don't know, though, but, like, I think we don't want it. But I do think that they're like the dummies in the audience want it.
I don't know. Do the when I think of the dummies in the audience, I think of the people who, you know, like I said at the start, the people when they're faced with The Shining, they're like, I wasn't scared. I like, is there that overlap from the people who are still in love with The Shining that they see this and they're like, I'm dying for the sequel?
I remember when I did my presentation back like 6+ years ago, like at least half the class, like if not more, raised their hand when I said, like, have you seen The Shining before?
Okay.
And considering that this is considered a staple, I would imagine most people are familiar with enough elements of it, like the face through the door, the
your iconic stuff. Yeah.
Yes, your iconic stuff. Because even how the trailer freaking begins, it's like the exact same shot of a car driving on that long and winding like roadway, like overlooking the lake, except it's at night. Like that's the opening shot. We see Danny Torrance open. And the other thing that shocked me is that like it's the Overlook Hotel, but it's the Stanley Kubrick Overlook. It's not the 2000 miniseries. It's not a new Overlook design. It is the exact same Overlook from the Kubrick film.
Yeah.
And like even in the beginning of the trailer, it shows Ewan McDonald walking around, and like it's the exact same chandelier. Like it's everything. Like he walks into the goddamn apartment they lived in for a couple of months, and the red, and it doesn't make any freaking sense because the red rum is still on the door. So you're telling me that like at the end of the movie that oh my god, Ullman just walked away?
Yeah, I think that's what I gathered from the trailer where they say, and there's some throwaway line in the trailer where they're like, we shut down all operations and just abandoned it after what happened to your family. And it's like, what? Why?
And then before
the hotel burns down in the original book. The hotel shouldn't be there at the end of the original Shining.
Well, we're not going to get into that, but because Stanley Kubrick said "F you" to Stephen King.
Yeah,
but even like within the first 30 seconds of this trailer, we have a shot of like Ewan McDonald looking through the axe like doorway, and then we have like a shot of like the iconic like Overlook Shining like hallways, and then we have a shot and we have a snap zoom jump scare of the two twins holding hands.
Yep.
And that's within the first 30 seconds. And I want to read a quote that I found about this movie from the director, Mike Flanagan. And this is what he said about the movie.
What has Mike Flanagan done? Anything I would know?
Okay, he's done. I'm going to read you his directing, his film directing. He's done Ouija, Origin of Evil.
Oh God. You can stop there, right?
Gerald's Game, Oculus, Hush, and then he directed an episode of Untold Stories from the he was the associate editor for an episode of Untold Stories of the ER. He directed an episode he edited an episode of $1 Million Listings Los Angeles. And he's a writer, director, creator, editor, and executive producer of The Haunting of Hill House.
Okay,
so
Netflix. nothing I would know him from, and nothing stands out to me. Okay.
So this is the quote that he said in regards to Dr. Sleep. And keep in mind that within the first 30 seconds of the trailer, we have a jump scare featuring the twins from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote, reconcile. Okay. Okay. While this is from the article right now, while the film Dr. Sleep is intended to be a direct adaptation of the 2013 sequel novel, director Mike Flanagan said Dr. Sleep would still acknowledge Kubrick's The Shining in some way. Flanagan said it is an adaptation of the novel Dr. Sleep, which is Stephen King's sequel to his novel, The Shining. But this also exists very much in the same cinematic universe that Kubrick established in the adaptation of The Shining. He explained working with all the sources. Quote, reconciling those three, at times very different, sources has been kind of the most challenging and thrilling part of this creatively for us. He first visited the novel, then had a conversation with King to work out adapting both sources. As part of the process, Flanagan recreated scenes from The Shining to use in flashbacks. He also avoided the horror film trope of jump scares as The Shining did. Keep in mind, folks, the first 30 seconds of the trailer has a jump scare of Stanley Kubrick iconography from The Shining.
Jesus.
And this is the thing that pisses me off, is that you have Stephen King, who despises the film, has despised it for almost 40 years.
Yep.
You have a director who claims to not doing any of this stuff. And this is the thing, too. I would imagine Stanley Kubrick probably had written into his contract at the time that they couldn't make a sequel to this without his involvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would
So-
totally imagine that. Yeah.
And this is the thing that bothers me, that like for the same reason why that the Kubrick estate won't let us have like the Ullman hospital scene, yet they will allow a bastardization of his film.
Oh God. Yeah, I don't know. I don't get it.
It makes me genuinely angry because it's
Yeah.
like you have like Stanley Kubrick isn't just your like token filmmaker. He's one of the very few filmmakers in the history of cinema that is truly like imitable. There is not just like it's just there's nobody else like him. He was this like once in a lifetime or once in a generation filmmaker that you don't get another of. And yet Warner Brothers, in a cheap like effort to make a buck, is just let's just use stuff from the film. It doesn't matter.
I'm imagining that there's people at Warner Brothers or Warner Brothers is doing Dr. Sleep, right? Yeah,
Yep.
they're doing the footage, recreation footage. But I imagine there's someone there who's like, oh, it sucks that we can't like soft reboot The Shining. And then someone intern went, no, Stephen King wrote a sequel like, 20, 30 years later. And they go, thank God we can do that. Money, 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 money.
Yeah, that's it's okay. Like that's the weird thing because like, when they first announced this, it sounded like a horrible idea, and I'm like, oh, but then I realized like the only thing that again I never really had any genuine interest in seeing this, but like the idea was kind of like interesting, being like, oh, like on like a creative level as a producer, it's like, oh, you have Stephen King, who's really hot right now when it comes to like readapting his works. It's interesting that we keep getting readaptations of already familiar Stephen King works, whether it be Carrie, Pet Sematary. It's amazing that none of the stuff he's written in the last 25 years gets adapted into new stuff. Isn't that amazing? That
Well,
Stephen
I
King-
mean, Zach, you're clearly forgetting the grandly successful TV adaptation of Under the Dome, starring Dean Norris.
Well, sure.
No, I agree with you. Everything, all his adaptations in the recent years have not been. I haven't enjoyed them at all.
But I think it's interesting though that like Hollywood has been like so, like, they put him again. They hold King in such high regard, yet they refuse to adapt any of his new stuff.
Yeah, it doesn't have that power like the old stuff does. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think find it interesting that like, oh, King doesn't like anything Kubrick did, so why would you pull from that? Again, it goes back to the whole thing too, is that like, do something new, do a new Overlook. Yes, you can say it's the sequel to The Shining because it technically is. It's the sequel. It's the adaptation of the sequel book. But the thing, because I remember when my mother, again, for spoiler alert for people who want to read Dr. Sleep and who haven't seen it, because my mother read that and she really liked the book.
Okay.
She liked it and she said, "Oh, it's really cool in the end. What happened?" And I'm like, "Okay, what happens?" She goes, "In the end, like I don't know, because every movie now has to be. I'm sorry, every book, everything now has to be like a Marvel like battle at the end."
Of course.
She goes like in the end of the book when like Danny's fighting like all the villains, Jack Torrance shows up to save him, and Jack Torrance is redeemed. He essentially Jack Torrance. Okay, thank you. That's the correct response. That's the correct response.
What the fuck?
We have Force Ghost Jack Torrance.
That's what I was about to say. This is so ridiculous.
I know, but this is the $1 million question now. Are we going? This feels like a Rise of Skywalker level question now. Right, I think Rob knows where I'm going with this.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to get a digitally de-aged Jack Nicholson?
Oh, 100%.
That has to happen, right?
100%. Now that you said that, because I didn't know much about the book. The only thing I really know about Dr. Sleep, the book, is that Danny Torrance is like a falling down drunk to suppress The Shining. I don't know if they're going to put that in the movie, but that's literally like anything I knew about Dr. Sleep. I never read it, but that just sounds ridiculous to me.
And I want to point out again, I know last year, folks, I had this like the exact same rant, so that's why I saved it for the very end, so you can tune out after this part. Is that like I complained about Hollywood 2018, and spoiler alert, I actually really liked that movie. It was I genuinely enjoyed it. It was nowhere near as bad as like I was expecting it to be.
Oh yeah, I guess we can say now I've finally seen it, and I actually liked it too.
Yeah, and Rob doesn't even remember the first Halloween, other than like it scared like the crap out of him.
Yeah, thanks, Dad.
But the thing that pisses me off, like after all we've been talking about for like 3 hours, there's a scene in this trailer, and in what makes it even worse, it's the J.J. Abrams thing of we have Danny Torrance riding his little like tricycle or big wheel down the hallway, and it's not the footage from The Shining. They reshot the exact same footage, and this is the part that genuinely makes my blood boil. He stops, turns around, we see the room 237 door, and the door opens by itself.
Yep, no key in it either. I noticed that.
No key in it. And you're completely ruining, you are retelling the first film. This is like a George Lucas like special edition thing again. You are retelling a perfect or you have a film. Like, it's very rare for a film to be considered perfect. You have pretty much, for all intents and purposes, a perfect The Shining that you feel compelled to and it's not even just a perfect film just in the film itself. It was a perfect film directed by one of the most, I don't want to say it, like a filmmaker that was beyond reproach, Stanley Kubrick, and yet Mike Flanagan feels, I can do this better than Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah. Fuck.
And it's like, F you, Mike Flanagan. No. Like, if you want to like fill in like blank spaces, like how we talked about like, like we want to know what happened like at the scrapbook scene, or like what happened to Wendy when Jack goes investigates room 237. If you want to do those moments, if you want to fill in the gaps, that's fine. But
build off something where there's an empty plot of land. Don't build off of something that's already been furnished and established.
Because you can't replicate perfection.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
And like, it makes me angry. Like, it genuinely makes me angry. And we haven't even gotten into the plot of this film. The plot of, not the film, but the plot of the book is like, there's a vampire cult, and Danny Torrance has to team up with a little girl, and they fight a vampire cult. And the only way they can fight the vampire cult is by being on home turf, and that's the Overlook Hotel. So like, the last 30 minutes of this movie is going to be like Home Alone, and the Overlook Hotel is going to be the McAllister house.
Are they actually vampires in the book? Do you know?
It's something like that. I think they changed it in the movie, but I remember when the book was being released in college, and I was reading about it. And I remember reading the synopsis being like, Danny Torrance is fighting vampires. I'm like, what the hell is this? And I was like, I don't care. Like, again, you can't improve upon perfection, Stephen King.
Fuck. I'm reading from the oh god. It's so the villains are a group of quasi-immortals, many of which possess their own shine abilities, who wander across the United States. There's more.
Stop the tape. Say the phrase. Say the phrase quasi-immortals without breaking out into laughter.
You can't at all.
So, okay. I don't want Rob to say any more about this, because this is kind of like
better. They're Stephen King's stupid version of vampires.
Stop. This is like Matthew Bright saying, like, naming underage girls he had sex with. I don't want to know anymore, because it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse.
Fair.
And I'm going to end this episode with an open-ended, or maybe not, maybe a rhetorical question for the audience, but I'm pretty sure Rob will answer it. And this is my question. Based on what I've seen in this trailer, and based off the very limited synopsis Rob was able to read until I stopped him, is there a good possibility that Stephen King only wrote this novel?
Oh my God! I'm gonna have to ask you to ask this question again, Zach. In the book, Dr. Sleep, the fucking little girl has the ability to shine and predicts 9/11. Oh God, this sounds so bad.
Okay. Well, okay, folks. You know,
I'm closing the page. I'm done with Dr. Sleep. I'm ready for the question.
Okay. Before I get to the question, though, and this part will have to be edited out. Folks, Rob and I had a quick little conversation, and like Rob said, it's not a lie. We're still trying to figure out what the next episode is, but there's a very real possibility that there's going to be no episode October 28th, and you might have to wait until Halloween Day for the final episode of Monstober, because we might have something in mind for that episode.
Monstober gets even more disjointed.
The only proper way to conclude Monstober 2019.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
See how it goes. Keep an eye out. You know, of course, we'll have an episode that week. We'll never just leave you hanging. But if it's delayed, you know it's always going to be for a grand old reason.
All right, Rob. So this is the question I was going to ask you.
I'm ready.
Did Stephen King write this just to spite Stanley Kubrick?
Okay.
Knowing that people would, when this film does come out, that it would inevitably, it'll be, oh God, forever be linked to Stanley Kubrick's film based on what they're doing, in that by association devalue that film's importance?
I would have to guess, since I don't know for sure, yes, absolutely. I mean, Stephen King is, when he wrote this sequel to Dr. Sleep, it was kind of like, at least what I know from his bibliography, is that this book came when he was finally winding down, at least, what existed at that point, the Dark Tower series, where, he got up to part 7 or something like that with the Dark Tower series, and then there was the Dark Tower that didn't get a number, and then there was Dr. Sleep. I feel like, that is exactly what he was looking at, because, when he was writing the Dark Tower series, he was like, this is my universe. The Dark Tower is connected to all my other books, and they all take place in the same universe. And whenever I read one of the Dark Tower books, which I can't stand, like, I love Stephen King's books, I hate the Dark Tower series, but that's what I got. I got the sense of, this is going to be a movie series, a franchise one day. And I think, when that bombed, what was that, Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey, it was like, what else can we do? And Stephen King, before Dr. Sleep, had some success with, as we said, Under the Dome, that TV adaptation. And I think maybe a year or two after Dr. Sleep, Hulu did the adaptation of 11/22/63. So I totally think maybe if it wasn't his intention, I'm going to write this and sell the rights like a Michael Crichton type of thing, where he was just writing books to sell to movie studios. He had to have it in the back of his head. He did not like the legacy that The Shining has, because it's overshadowed by the film and not his novel, that he had to undo the crimes against his writing. I could totally see Stephen King having that mentality, and now it's finally coming to fruition.
Stephen King has a current net worth of $400 million. He's one of the most revered authors, yet he, for some reason, can't. Think of all the adaptations there are of his books, of his works. Yet he still can't. 40 years later, he's still, or technically 35 years when this was written.
Exactly.
He's still that angry about it.
Yeah,
Can you imagine having this is a man that got ran over by a car, has all this success, has millions of fans worldwide, yet he can't get over the fact that one adaptation very early in his career of such things wasn't the way he saw fit. And he just can't get over that he feels that now, 20 years after the filmmaker is dead, he's going to sit there and do this. And this is the question I'd love to know. Considering that Kubrick, again, had all these things with his films, I would imagine there must have been a clause in his Shining contract, probably from sometime in 1970 something, that Warner Brothers could not use any of his stuff unless him or his estate signed off on it, which I'm guessing they probably wrote a check to his estate.
Yeah, I would totally imagine that. And, I think that this is something I'm sure has stuck with Stephen King for a long, long time. Because, The Shining in 1980 came out, and, he's had that legacy with it forever, but he's certainly always been, as I've described him, a self-centered author. A lot of his characters are him. Of course, everybody knows, every book he writes, most of the books he writes take place in Maine, where he lives. They're about things that happen to him. I think the best and most notable example is Misery. That was his dream of somebody loving his work so much that they need to capture them and hold them hostage type of thing. And of course, then even after Misery, when you get to the mid-90s, when he did his full rehab stint, I can only imagine, once you go sober, the things that harkened on you as an artist start to grate on you more. And that thing with Kubrick has to be one of those, from everything we've heard about Stephen King. So I could totally see that is totally his mindset, maybe not completely consciously, but it's some motivation back in the dark corner of his mind, if anything.
All right. Well, Rob says this. I'm going to play a clip. I don't know how it's going to sound. All right, I can always edit that. But Rob, I guess neither one of us can talk. But I'm going to play this clip, and for our audience, we're going to edit it out, or we'll insert the audio, and then Rob and I are going to respond to it.
Okay.
Jack Nicholson plays Jack Torrance, an unstable writer who takes the job of winter caretaker at the secluded Overlook Hotel.
Is there something bad here?
Well, you know, Doc, when something happens, it can leave a trace of itself behind. Things that people who shine can see.
Jack and his son Danny have a psychic gift, a shining, that lets them see the ghosts of the murdered people at the Overlook. Those ghosts terrorize Danny while they slowly drive Jack insane.
Jack Torrance, he's an alcoholic. He doesn't know how to control it. And he blames his son and his wife for his artistic impotence.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was.
There's something about this hotel that just wants the people who go there to murder each other.
Come and play with us, Daddy. Forever. And ever. And ever.
The Shining is filled with the kind of iconic scenes you'd expect from one of history's greatest directors. But Kubrick made many changes to King's story that didn't sit well with its author.
I can enjoy it on the same level that you could enjoy a beautifully restored Cadillac without a motor in it. You know, my rap about it is there's no character arc. In the book, Jack Torrance goes from a nice guy who's trying to get better for his family and for himself. And I felt like Jack Nicholson played Jack Torrance as though he were crazy from the
Crazy
jump.
from minute one.
That is quite a story.
Talking with Mr. Ullman in the office, and Ullman saying this and that, and Jack's going, yes, absolutely, Mr. Ullman.
Well, you can rest assured, Mr. Ullman, that's not going to happen with me.
I also thought that Kubrick had taken a pretty strong, scary suspense horror novel and turned it into an art film.
I don't think that could have been like any different from Room 237. Any more different from Room 237.
But the thing about this, though, is that, again, King's comments, I'm shocked. Well, I'm not shocked. But, like, I just can't wrap my head around the fact of being that successful over your career and still being angry about the one thing that didn't go your way. I guess it's just the fact that, like, if you have everything else in life, it's that one thing that's always going to be the thing that stands out. But it's interesting that in the I can't believe that even, like, King makes fun of Jack Nicholson. Like, if this was, like, 10 years, you do not make fun of Jack Nicholson. And Jack Nicholson's considered also one of the greatest actors of all time. I think it was in the behind-the-scenes stuff for The Shining on the Blu-ray. Steven Spielberg is talking about it. He goes, I thought Jack Nicholson was his performance is too campy. And I'll insert the clip here where this Steven Spielberg tells this anecdote. And he goes, well, Steven, who are your favorite actors? Quick, without thinking. And Steven Spielberg, like, rattles off a couple of names like Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, Spencer Tracy. And he goes, stop there. And Spielberg goes, okay. He goes, well, one of my favorite actors is Jimmy Cagney. And Jimmy Cagney was this very over-the-top, like, performer. He's the one everybody knows from, like, Scarface with the original Scarface with the grapefruit into the woman's face. Jimmy Cagney, in most of his roles, had this kind of, like, over-the-top energy that he brought to roles. Spielberg concludes it by saying that, like, what Kubrick's response was, just because it's not what you wanted doesn't make it over the top. If that just because you don't think that's what's best for it doesn't mean that it's inappropriate for what I'm going for.
I saw Stanley St. Albans, and he asked me, how did you like my movie? And I only seen it once, and I didn't love Shining the first time I saw it. I have since seen Shining 25 times, one of my favorite pictures. Kubrick films tend to grow on you. You have to see them more than once. And I was telling him all the things I liked about it, and he saw right through me. And he said, well, Stephen, obviously you didn't like my picture very much. Tell me what you didn't like about it. I thought Jack Nicholson, who was a great actor, I thought it was a great performance, but it was almost a great kabuki performance. It was almost like kabuki theater. He said, you mean you think Jack went over the top? And I said, yeah, I kind of did. And he said, okay, quickly, without thinking, who are your top favorite actors of all time? And I want you to think, just name off some names. So I quickly, went Spencer Tracy, Henry Fonda, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant, Clark Gable. He said, stop. He stopped me. He said, okay, where was James Cagney on that list? And I didn't have, I thought, well, he's up there high. So I said, but he's not in the top 5. He said, you don't consider James Cagney one of the 5 best actors around. You see, I do. This is why Jack Nicholson's performance is a great one.
Here's Johnny.
To this day, I cannot figure out why King is so angry about this.
Yeah, opinions, man, they exist.
But like the thing about this, like who knows? Stanley Kubrick didn't make The Shining. Who knows? And it's not like Stephen King didn't get any extra additional bump from that. It wasn't like it came out and it damaged his career. It's not like Stephen King was trying to sell a manuscript in the summer of 1980, and guess what? He got rejected because people hated The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I mean he is still to this day benefiting off that film.
Absolutely.
You know, he hates it, and like I think Rob Scott. Even though I'm going to reserve my final judgment until I see this dumb movie.
Sure.
But like, it's hard to not at least understand the perspective that King wrote this solely to try to tarnish the 1980 film's legacy.
Yeah, it seems that way to me from what I know about Stephen King and his kind of perception of his art throughout the years. But of course, you know, I think that's never something he's going to admit to. It's just going to be a rumor mill type of thing. But I got to imagine there's other people thinking that while we're thinking the same thing. If they know that Stephen King doesn't like the Kubrick movie, and then, you know, The Shining 2, Dr. Sleep comes out so many years later, it leads itself to that story that he was doing it for that kind of not pettiness or maliciousness, but that revamping.
I think it is maliciousness.
Kind of malicious towards that film, but I think Stephen King sees it more as reclaiming his property.
Then why did he like? That's the weird thing about Stephen King, though. Is like, look at all the subpar adaptations of his works that are in existence.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Like Rob knows for like a year now I've talked about doing like the Stephen King series, and like Rob's never seen Sleepwalkers.
Nope.
Sleepwalkers is like the most insane movie you will ever see, based on like a commercial property, and the amount of like talent there is in that film is like bonkers. And I don't want Rob to look into that just now, because we'll get to Sleepwalkers one day.
Okay.
But it's like, it's one of those movies that like, oh, he's okay with that. And I wonder if part of it too is the fact that like he feels like Stephen King, oh God, all these freaking names that begin with the letter S. Stanley Kubrick outdid him. And I wonder I don't think it's the fact that he's mad because it didn't go his way. I think it's jealousy. I think, again, King is probably a narcissist, and he probably sees that Kubrick outdid him.
Yes, that's a really good way to put it. Yep, that's what I was getting at with him being a very self-centered author earlier. I think that's exactly got to be a big part of the motivation from him.
Yeah. So if I can't beat him, I'm going to ruin his legacy now. And I'm going to buy off, much like how Kubrick was able to buy me off when I didn't have the stature or clout to defend myself, quote unquote. Now that he's no longer around for 20 years, and his widow's like 90, Christiana's like 20, oh God, she's like 90 years old now.
Okay.
And probably the daughters are in charge of like probably managing her just bills and her well-being. They probably see, oh, Warner Brothers is willing to write us a check for $20 million to do whatever they want with the footage, or just reshoot anything that we want. So why not?
Hell yeah, get that paycheck.
I don't know, how much did this cost? Like, I see. What was the budget on this? This had to be $100 million film.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, absolutely. But I definitely think, you know, it's something that I've been familiar with artists, you know, because art gets adapted, readapted, recreated, remade, reworked, and it all comes down to, you know, you give those rights away at the start, or maybe not give them away, but you give your permission type of thing, and it doesn't always turn out the way you like, and it all comes down to the artist, to how you handle it. And I think what we're seeing, as what we've discussed, is Stephen King is not happy about it, and he's trying to reclaim that territory by tarnishing this older film. But, you know, the other side of the coin, I think, happens a lot more with music. I mean, still to this day, when I talk to anybody about the song Mad World, they think of the Gary Jules and Michael Andrews version from Donnie Darko. And that's a great song.
And I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world.
But that song was written by Tears for Fears almost 20 years earlier. And Tears for Fears is like, we don't care that more people know Gary Jules and Michael Andrews writing that song than we do. We're just happy that it got out there. We wrote that song, and we wrote it very upbeat. They wrote it very down-tempo, but we're glad that people are listening to it. And that's where they differ from Stephen King, where Stephen King's not saying, oh, I'm glad they did something different with my work and drew attention to it. He's more of the one saying, no, mine. I don't like what you did. I need to undo it. You know, Tears for Fears still tours to this day. And when they play Mad World, they play their version. They're never going to play the other version. They're never going to play a different version because they know it's not theirs. And I think that's, from my artistic opinion, that's what Stephen King should realize. We could argue this to death, do a whole nother episode about it. Once your art is out in the world, you own a little bit less of it. I know that's a Star Wars argument. Who owns Star Wars? The fans or George Lucas or Disney, whoever the hell now. But once your work is out in the world and it gets known in a certain way, who owns it? That's a tough question. And artists deal with that in different ways. And Stephen King is dealing with it, as we said, in that little more malicious way, we think.
Yeah, because I'm even trying to find the budget for Dr. Sleep, and I can't find anything on it. All I keep seeing is articles claiming that The Shining was a, I don't want to say it was a flop, but a lot of people, because they're saying like, oh, it only made $44 million on a $19 production budget. Well, this is also in 1980.
Yeah, exactly.
With inflation, a $19 million budget is around like $60 million, and $44 million is around like $150. So like in today's dollars, it tripled its budget. And that was also back in the day too, where they just kept that was in the 1980s, where they just kept re-releasing things over and over and over again. Yep. And never mind, there was not Blu-ray. There was VHS rentals. There was Laserdisc. There were VHS copies back when they used to cost like $60 a piece.
Okay.
So I think it's kind of nervy to say at the box that The Shining was an underperformer at the box office.
Mm-hmm.
Much like what Rob and I have been saying now for a while when it comes to the Twilight Zone revamp. I think the phrase "everybody involved should be ashamed of themselves."
Oh yeah,
definitely comes to mind.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I mean, that trailer, I have no interest from that trailer. It's gonna look like some bonkers nonsense, and we'll see how it goes.
The Shining was the 14th highest-grossing film of 1980.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, below Smokey and the Bandit 2, The Blue Lagoon, The Blues Brothers.
Smokey is the Bandit.
Smokey and the Bandit 3. Smokey is the Bandit.
Popeye, Empire Strikes Back, Airplane. But it's above Caddyshack, Friday the 13th.
Oh, wow.
And Cheech and Chong's next movie.
Oh, interesting.
And it also outgrossed the Song of the South remake, or reissue.
Wasn't Elephant Man 1980, or was that 80?
Yep,
or 81?
Yep.
Oh, that was 80? Okay.
That made $26 million.
Ah, gotcha.
Yep.
I'm not an animal. Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's so weird, when you dive into these things and it's like, it's just so strange and convoluted to talk about, because it's just like it's going to happen. Nothing we're saying is going to stop this movie from coming out, and all these intentions happening, and it's just what it's going to be interesting to see. Is it bomb? Is it successful? Are we going to get a lot of reviews that are like, this is better than The Shining, blah 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 blah? It's going to be crazy.
The critics won't say it's better. Okay,
Twitter's going to say it's better than The Shining. I'll bet you anything. I'll bet you anything that there's a group of people that gain momentum that say this is the better movie. Absolutely.
Oh, well, of course. Well, there's always going to be that contingent of any sort of like fan base. But I think, remember, depending on what we think, there's a possibility that King wants this to be bad.
Oh yeah, absolutely, to tarnish that reputation. Sure.
So if he goes back and like plays with things, I think it's not just the critics. I think he wants. It's kind of like the thing that happened with Star Wars, where people start saying, "Oh, it's like with Star Wars, like, oh, the prequels are bad. They retroactively ruined Star Wars."
Yeah.
And then over time, Return of the Jedi starts being labeled as bad. It's like, why? Well, because the only good ones are Empire and A New Hope, and I think that's what he wants. I think he, much like how we talked about Kubrick playing the long game, I think that's what probably King's figuring out. Oh, if this movie goes out there, it's bad. People just by iconography will start associating itself with the previous film, and you guess what? You drag both of them down.
I can only hope that we get, that's sarcastic, that we get people saying either not much Shining or Dr. Sleep ruined my child. Because I would love to, if anybody says that, I would love to talk to them and be like, please explain to me how the original Shining was your childhood. Because you're an interesting person in that own respect.
I bet there's someone out there. That'll say that.
Absolutely. So, interesting. Okay, Zach's angry, and
yes, I am.
We're letting him off his leash. So,
Shining epilogue, people.
Dr. Sleep.
After talking about The Shining for like 3.5 hours, there's not enough said about The Shining from the Cinemodities podcast. So I'm holding Rob against his will. I have him, for once, I had the battery acid that I'm using against him.
I don't think anybody in the audience understands that Zach sent me a middle finger emoji in front of a picture of the Dr. Sleep Red Rum poster. That's the equivalent of like a nuclear bomb for Zach. Like sending a middle finger emoji. That's the hardest of the hardcore disses from someone like him.
I wanted to give the actual finger, but there were people in the lobby, and considering my reputation at that theater, I think it's best not to do anything that incites them against me even further. But yeah, so Dr. Sleep, I've had quite a few thoughts on this. In the week since we recorded that episode, I actually went and listened to another podcast that did something very similar to what Rob and I do on Cinemodities, where they have a bunch of clips. I think Rob would love them.
Okay.
If it weren't this podcast I listened to, I don't even remember their names. I don't even know how to find their episode now because I didn't subscribe to them. I would describe that podcast as a combination between Cinemodities and the Amazon Women on the Moon podcast, because this podcast had like a ton, like Rob would love it. They had so many clips, they had so much audio, but it was a man and a woman, and clearly the man wanted to do the woman.
And she was from Detroit?
I don't know. It wasn't said they were from Detroit. I was hoping that maybe if I listened to the entire show, they would eventually tip their cards a little bit. But like the best part was, and I find this a very interesting dynamic between podcasters, if one is a woman and one is a man. The man always uses the pronoun we. Oh, when we talk about this, we have audible credits. And she always says I. She always uses a singular pronoun where he uses a combined pronoun or a plural pronoun. And I just find that fascinating. But that's neither here nor there. So I listened to them, and they were like, it kind of made me, they had some insights, but it was that, like, they keep talking about like the theories in room 237, and they're like, I don't want to hurt anybody's opinions. Like, all these people are entitled to their beliefs, but they're wrong. And I'm like, no, you don't get to have it both ways. And then at one point too, they're talking about like Scatman Crothers talking to Danny about the shine. They're like, when we say the word shine, we are not using that as a racial slur. And I'm like, why would anybody think you're using it as a racial slur? You're talking about a movie called The Shining where the characters say the word like, oh, Danny. My grandmother and I used to call it the shine. Some people shine, some places shine. And they're like, we don't want you to think that we're being racist by using this term. It's like, what? I couldn't. It was entertaining, like in a baffling way. Like it wasn't as bad as the other one before, where clearly, again, the guy wanted the woman like really bad, and she was 100% oblivious to it. This was a little bit more low key, but still, it was like this weird sort of just dynamic between male and female podcasters that aren't married. But anyway, though, so I've been doing a bunch of thinking about this. I think I meant to bring it up last week when we were talking about Dr. Sleep, in that Dr. Sleep, in the Shining novel, Halloran lives.
Yeah. The only person that dies is Jack Torrance.
Yes.
When the hotel burns down, and then Wendy, Danny, and Halloran get away.
Yes, but in the movie, he dead.
Definitely.
And if you remember correctly, folks, again, it was a week ago for Rob and I. It was a couple of minutes ago for you listening to this. The director says we have to reconcile.
Now you're in a time vortex, listeners.
Yes, we're all in the Shining. We're all in the Overlook right now. We're recording live from Colorado. I'm recording live from Colorado. Not Rob's always recording live from Colorado.
You didn't tell me you were going to be in Colorado, Zach.
I've always been there. I was just in the hotel. I was there half the time I was here in New York. I didn't even know where I was. But no. But in this Dr. Sleep movie, there's a hollering in the movie.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We see someone who's playing like
not Scatman
the same character. Right? It's not Scatman Crothers
playing Scatman Crothers.
Exactly.
And how they get they are leaning so heavily into the Stanley Kubrick film. Yet the only character that dies in that film is being brought back. Imagine watching like a Godfather Part 2 where Marlon Brando is back.
I don't know. I don't understand it either, Zach.
Like, what are they thinking? Like, are they just like, is this just one of those things where we're like, you know what? The audience is stupid. They won't even realize. Like, nobody knows Scatman Crothers was a person. We can just tell people he's alive and no one's going to question it. Or is this King saying, you know what? I'm going to F up the previous movie. Another example of that.
That's where we keep wanting to go back to, but I don't know. I feel like that's something that I would expect them to explain, whether it's fully detailed or just a throwaway line of dialogue. I think that's something they would have to explain in the film. Since they're relying so heavily on the Kubrick material, if they're bringing that character back and it's not just in flashbacks, then they're going to have to tell the audience why to some extent, right?
I guess. I wish I had an answer.
We're going to have to wait till the movie comes out.
I guess. But no, so that was kind of the first thing, was that like I was kind of like flabbergasted at that, being like, what the hell is going on?
What did you send me on Facebook about Goosebumps?
The second thing is that as I was like looking into more information about like excised footage from The Shining and like all this stuff, I came across 2 articles. I should link to both of them in the show notes. One of them is from EW called The Shining Producer Explains Ending Changes. And the other one is called Why You'll Never See the Missing 2001 A Space Odyssey, something.
Mm-hmm.
But in this first article from EW, The Shining Ending Explained, it was published March 30th, 2017. It's not too long ago, about 2.5 years ago. And in it, they interviewed Diane Johnson, the co-screenwriter of The Shining, and Jan Harlan, who was a producer on many of Kubrick's films. It was also his brother-in-law. And in that documentary I talked about, last week, earlier this episode.
10 minutes ago.
He's featured a lot in it. And the weird thing is that like he's there here and there. And I know Jan Harlan's kind of become the voice of the Kubrick like estate when it comes to his movies. Okay. Like I've said that like Kubrick's widow, Christiana, she's like almost 90. So I would imagine I have not seen her interviewed in a while. So I'm not sure if it's just she has no more interest in this, or it's just she's gotten to an age where she can't do it anymore. It's anyone's guess. But I'm guessing that her brother's probably the one that's just doing it all, considering that he was much more involved with the productions than she was. And in this article, it's a really fascinating article because they talk about a bunch of things about like this excised footage, a lot of the different endings that Kubrick had in mind for The Shining that he eventually discarded. But
was my favorite part, the different treatments they described.
Yeah, that stuff was really neat.
That's my only other note that I have about this, is that I thought it was interesting that Halloran was going to be the possessed demon villain in the third act in one of the treatments.
Which I thought would have been really cool. But that's neither here nor there. Because one of the things I found interesting was that like Harlan talks about how like when like originally Kubrick didn't want to do this, and he just wanted something commercial. And that's one thing, even like prior to recording this, and when Rob delayed our recording by like an hour, I was kind of glad because I was rewatching that Stanley Kubrick documentary. And one thing it seemed like was that Kubrick was, I don't want to say obsessed, maybe that's too strong of a word, but he definitely wanted his films to be box office successes, which I would imagine that most filmmakers do. Like he was not in, like Kubrick was an artistic filmmaker, but I think he was concerned about the box office. It wasn't like one of these things like other filmmakers like David Lynch, where it's like, okay, if my films don't do well, it's not the end of the world as long as I'm able to tell the story I want to tell. I think Kubrick always did have his finger on the pulse of like, oh, I want this thing. Like, I want it to succeed financially, not just critically, because a lot of Kubrick's films weren't critically lauded when they first came out. And that was one of the big takeaways I took from rewatching the documentary, because in the 2001 article, there's a point in that article where it's referenced that after the first screening of it, Kubrick and the producers and like the studio heads like had like a discussion about editing part of the film to like make it tighter, take more of the run, lower the runtime. And in the documentary, they talk about that Christiana says that like after the film like had its first like showing, she and Kubrick went to like a hotel room with a bunch of the producers and executives, and they basically argued for like the entire night over what to take out of the film. Okay. And I think it's interesting that like, oh, when that documentary was like produced like in 2001, we're still seeing it talked about, God, like 20 something years later. And I just found that interesting that Kubrick was somebody that was again, he was not as abstract as a David Lynch or a Terrence Malick or some of those other filmmakers that really wanted to kind of keep things cloudy. With that being said, it's the idea that when you apply that sort of thinking to The Shining, and I know in one of the parts where Harlan's talking, he goes, this is a quote from him. He says, very often crew members asked him, can you explain that to me? And he said, I never explain anything. I don't understand it myself. It's a ghost film! Exclamation mark.
It's a ghost film.
You can't imagine how much fuss was made over the big golden ballroom and the big lobby and huge windows that could have never fit into the hotel based on the establishing shot from the outside. Any child could see that, and Stanley's explanation was, it's a ghost film! Forget it! End quote. It's not a movie with a serious message. I know many people think it's impossible that Kubrick did a film which didn't have serious messages and an enormous amount of theory. An enormous amount of invented. Okay, that person put the wrong parenthetical. An amount of theories. While he was alive, that was relatively quiet. After his death, these theories came out, which were funny and partly insulting. Then we start seeing the Holocaust stuff gets attacked.
It's a ghost film.
Yeah. That's an insult to Kubrick. He would never deal with this thing and this sort of subject. He goes, the other ideas are much more harmless, where continuity mistakes are attributed with deep meaning. But why rewatch that documentary today? There's like an opening montage, and it's literally it's from every single like headline a Kubrick film got when it like was released, or about basically any headline that revolved around either him or his films. And like one of the things is like perfectionist, all these things. And it's like, so you're telling me this is the guy that his entire life, like they even I forgot about how involved Barry Lyndon was. This is a guy that invented a camera lens that could capture natural light from like candles. And apparently like people in the film industry, people have been wanting the access to these lenses forever. And I think he either never let them have it, and I think at one point it was even rumored that he destroyed the lenses so nobody could ever do it again.
Oh my God.
But this was somebody who like went through such exacting detail. And even in the documentary, the part where they interview Sidney Pollack about Eyes Wide Shut, and I know earlier I said that film had like 400 takes, or I'm sorry, that sequence at the end had like 400 takes. He talks about Sidney Pollack that they reshot the ending sequence between him and Tom Cruise. It took 3 weeks for one scene. 3 weeks. And yet all this time we're supposed to believe Kubrick just completely gave up with this film and put no thought into it whatsoever.
Yeah. It's doesn't jive.
That's what I'm saying. And that's why, like, when I was reading this article, I'm like, God damn it, Rob, we have to add this on here, because this really it sheds a bunch of light onto something that I think is deliberately they're shedding light onto something just to muddy the waters.
Yeah, and I think that fits with everything we said, 18 minutes ago with the cat instructions and the attention to detail and all of that stuff. This is, it doesn't seem like Kubrick would be someone who would ever give way to that belief. He was one of the people we felt, would always go all the way, like full throttle 100% of the time. So we can't believe that anything was just a ghost film. Everything had meaning to him and care and detail.
Yeah. And that's the thing I find fascinating about this, because even earlier in the articles they mentioned something like Stephen King was very open to having like his work adapted. And they're like, and then in parenthetical it says at the time, and I'm like, I found that hilarious. And yeah, it's like, so clearly there is some resentment to Stephen King just bashing this film every 10 seconds he gets. And I didn't even, in that other podcast I was referencing, they play a bunch of the clips over the years of Stephen King just trashing this film. And he's never, I know one thing they pull from a lot that I haven't seen in years. They used to air it a lot on Bravo back, if Bravo's even the channel anymore. And they used to air it a lot back in the mid-2000s. It was like Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments. And I've forgotten that. Like, apparently Stephen King, all he does is bash the film there too. So like Stephen King's been like had this weird sort of like anti-hard-on against this film for practically ever.
That's a great phrase, anti-hard-on.
It really
is that like
is.
A reverse boner?
Something like that.
That's fantastic.
but getting back to more of like, we talked about the excise footage from The Shining and a bunch of things, because I know it's cited in the article with Leon Vitali, and I'll get into my insane hatred of him in a moment. But in the EW article, they talk about the scrapbook sequence.
Oh yeah.
And the thing I find fascinating is that there's like a part in this where it was like in the article where they're like, oh, like Kubrick like disposed of all of his footage. He didn't want anybody like tampering with his films. And I'm like, and it's like he didn't like, he lived in the current. He never looked in the past. And I'm like, why did he keep a prop from a scene he completely took out of the movie? Like if he didn't care about anything that he excised, then why not dispose of the prop? Like it doesn't have any, like it has really no purpose in the film. I think in the article it says you see it like in one or two shots very early on, but it serves no narrative purpose. And I think, and I meant to mention this in our discussion 15 minutes ago, was that this was, oh god, I think it was on the Reels channel. They did like one of those really super duper condensed like biographies of Stephen King, and they talk about the acts from The Shining. And they say that I think they produced 7 axes for the production of the film. 4 of them were destroyed during the production just because Kubrick had Nicholson do so many takes with them. He broke them after a while. But apparently there's still 3 in existence. One of them is with the Kubrick estate. The other one I think is in the Warner Brothers archives. And the third one is in like private collectors' hands.
Okay.
And that's the thing I find interesting, though, is like if Kubrick didn't care about any of this stuff, why did he like? That's the thing. If someone's going to keep props from the movies, and it's not just the studio keeping them, it's the filmmaker keeping them. I have a hard time believing, considering that a negative takes up like what? Hardly any room.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you have to keep it in a canister, and keeping an axe prop is different. You got to store it under different conditions. I can see that. But considering that Kubrick probably had all of his films in a salt mine somewhere, how hard would it be to keep one 3-minute long sequence of film?
Yeah, exactly. It seems totally possible.
You keep it for reference. For no other, you might, again, if somebody like Kubrick was that exacting, he would have kept it. Just, I might not ever need it. I might never want the public to ever see it, but I'm going to keep it just in case somebody ever does need it.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me of our discussion way back when we did Fantastic Four. Remember that documentary said Avi Arad burned all those prints? This just reminds me of that. Like, that seems so inconceivable to us, right? That you would burn all copies of something.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. Because even I found this article. I didn't send this one to Rob though, but apparently, one of the editors that Kubrick used for The Shining, I think died recently, as in the last couple of years. In 2017 or 18, a bunch of his personal effects went up for auction, and one of them was a print of The Shining. And guess what? It ran 2 minutes longer than the official edit did.
Oh,
and the opening bid for it was like $3,700. And I'm like,
that's it?
That was the opening bid. I looked into it. I couldn't find the final
what it sold for.
Yeah, I couldn't find it. I looked for it. I couldn't find it. I don't know. Maybe if they weren't allowed to sell it, something like that. I would imagine you can't. Like Kubrick probably gave this person a copy of it, and that's it. Like, you probably can be given it, you can't sell it. So I'm not sure. Maybe if Warner Brothers just bought it, be like, okay, we'll give you, tell us what you get it appraised, and we'll buy it from you.
Yeah, something like that.
But if that's like because I was thinking about like $3,700, you could start a Kickstarter overnight and say we are trying to raise money to buy this print of the film to show it. You could very easily raise $10,000 overnight from like people like me being like, okay, this is worth contributing like $50 to the chance of being like, okay, at least even though we might not be able to ever show it, we can then donate it to like the Museum of Modern Art or something like that.
Yeah.
And then they can show it as a piece of art. And the fact that I couldn't find any stories about it even selling leads me to believe that probably either the Kubrick estate or Warner Brothers bought it. And if that's the case, though, that means the footage still exists. That means that all this nonsense about, again, this is where we're going to also kind of like shift into the Leon Vitali part of the story. It's not like somebody getting off at the fact that this footage doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
And so then getting to the Leon Vitali part of the story, and I remember seeing, back when I did my research on the Shining presentation I did back in college, his name would show up in a couple of places, but I always knew him as like Lord Barrington in Barry Lyndon. He was an actor in that film. I think he showed me, God, he's like 20 years old in that. And then like over time, when I watched that Kubrick documentary back in the day, he's like listed, or his title is like assistant to Kubrick. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I know every single time, and he more or less started to show up a lot once like the film, like the Room 237 people, the people that really like overanalyzed all of Kubrick's films, that he started to show up again, because every single time somebody has a theory about anything Kubrick did, Leon Vitali basically like jumps through a window and is like, that didn't happen. That wasn't Kubrick's intent. And it's like, shut up. Like, have you not ever heard of film theory? It's like, just because somebody throws a theory out does not mean that you have to personally come out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
And like, oh God, but who's the basketball player? Remember Rob, the Guy Coke commercials? I forget the basketball player's name, that every single time somebody tried to like throw like a basketball or like a crumpled piece of paper up into a trash can, he'd be like, no, not this time. Oh God,
vaguely.
Okay, he's
I don't remember the name.
I can see him, but I can't think of his name.
Yeah,
and that's who Leon Vitali is when it comes to anything regarding. If you have an opinion on Stanley Kubrick that Leon Vitali doesn't like, he will show up and tell you you're wrong. I'm pretty sure he's going to break into this podcast at some point and tell us that we're full of it. Okay. And I've always hated him pretty much ever since then, because that's all he does. All he does is, again, he kind of his. Oh God, it's kind of like self-designated himself as like, the truth sayer,
the official, the expert, the authority on it.
Yes, he's basically granted himself the title of like the living persona of Stanley Kubrick. That like anything that has regarding his work, he's the official like final say on it. And that drives me nuts, because like I don't care how much you work with him, you can't get in somebody's mind like that. It's kind of like the person that worked at the patents office with Albert Einstein. I don't care how long you work with them. They have such a inimitable like mindset. I don't care. There's no osmosis there.
Yeah.
But the thing that really, and I've always hated Leon Vitali, but the thing that kind of drove me over the edge was that in this Yahoo article about the 2001 thing, is that he goes, there's a part of the article that says, still, there's one part of the 1968 viewing experience that Nolan, that being Christopher Nolan, can't duplicate for modern audiences. When 2001 first played for premiere audiences, the film was roughly 20 minutes longer than the one that went into wide release. The baffled reaction of those first moviegoers, as well as the studio, sent Kubrick back to the editing room to excise roughly 17 minutes of footage. Unlike some filmmakers, he wasn't concerned when it came to the film that ended up on the cutting room floor. Once he released the movie, that was it, said Leon Vitali. There's a place in London where all the city's refuse is taken, and I remember taking van loads of outtakes and stuff that was never used and burning them because he did not want any of his old material. And then he goes on to say, okay, there's more. While Kubrick's personal copy of those deleted 17 minutes roughly went up in smoke, it is worth noting that the footage still exists in the Warner Brothers vaults. And as far as the studio is concerned, that's where it'll stay. The stance may disappoint film buffs, but to music, that stance may disappoint film buffs, but it's music to Vitali's ears. Quote, I truly believe that they should absolutely not do anything to interfere with the film as it is now. If anybody has that kind of material, I would hope they'd say there's a reason why he didn't use it. And the weird thing about this, and there's more to this I could get into, but for brevity's sake, I won't. he says something. He goes later in the article, and he says something along the lines of, he's like, "Oh, when Kubrick like released a film in its final cut, that was it. Like there was no going back to it." And I'm like, well, it wasn't his final cut. He was strong armed into taking it out of there. So like and that goes to the Shining thing too at the end with the whole Room 237 sequence. I think in the EW article they talk about the scrapbook sequence being cut out in an earlier edit of the film. That was not a last minute edit. Yeah. And the thing that drives me nuts though is that it was part of his final edit. If people didn't strong arm him, it wouldn't have happened. And then even doing more research on this, I looked to see if any other filmmaker had ever edited the film after it was into release. And the thing with The Shining and the 2001 are kind of like, it's an apples versus oranges comparison, because The Shining was in release. The 2001 footage was not in release. Or for wide release, I mean. And it's the notion of, I don't think a filmmaker has ever done that before, where they've released a film into the public, into the public space, and then edit it from there.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
At least in a commercial sense. I'm pretty sure there's probably some auteur independent filmmaker that's done that. I'm not arguing that. Like somebody who makes a film gets their local independent art house film to show it.
Sure. Yeah.
And then it's okay, I'm going to cut stuff out of it later on, once it's gone to bigger, better things. I did research and I could not find another example of a filmmaker editing their film in wide release. And there's really no precedent for this. And this notion that you can't do this, it's the director's intent once they release a film, blah 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 blah. And I think part of it too is that nobody is saying that we want a George Lucas special edition of The Shining or 2001. Nobody is saying we want this footage reincorporated into the film. But I do think, considering that Kubrick did die at age 70, I would imagine that most people would probably God, he was born in 1929. He easily could have had another 10, 20 years in his life. I'm not saying he could have made more films in that time span, but it's the idea that he might have done some interviews. He might have written a memoir. Yeah. There might have been some insights. And considering that he died unexpectedly, considering that there is more of his work out there, not that it should be again, reintegrated into his film against his wishes. It should be at least be accessible to learn, to get more insights into how he thought.
Yep, exactly.
And that's what drives me nuts. It's the arrogance of the people like Jean Harlan and Leon Vitali. No, we are the gatekeepers of Stanley Kubrick. You are not allowed in. And Rob has said numerous times, it's no, his works now belong to the culture. Mm-hmm. And you are depriving us of this. And it's a very similar argument to the George Lucas Star Wars thing, where it's no, once you release a film that people other than you have seen it, you don't get to take that back. It's you don't I'm not arguing that on a legal property grounds. Yes, they Warner Brothers technically owns the film. They get the final say. But to discuss this in the arena of cultural significance, Kubrick took it out because he never wanted us to see it. Well, sure, but then he should never have released it in the first place. If he thought it was that bad, he should have pulled it out at the previous stops. I bet there's, probably scores of filmmakers that would love to go back during the film's release and pull things out. But they can't do that because that's not how you operate. And considering that this footage does survive, it should be in a place where people can not access it, but at least should be, at the very least, maybe it's not on the Blu-ray release, but maybe it should be in a museum. If you go to NYU, maybe there's a there's a copy of it there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just for make it, maybe again, not for the Blu-ray release, but if you spend $60,000 a year on getting a master's degree or a doctorate in film studies, then you can access it.
Yeah, it should be in an archive somewhere.
So some people, not just family member and quasi-family member gatekeepers, keep it away from the populace.
Yeah, I agree.
Because nobody's looking at this to use it to tear down Kubrick. They want to just understand. There's only so many Kubrick films in existence, and they're limited at that. This isn't exactly John Ford, who made hundreds of films. Mm-hmm. This is a man that pretty much all of his films you can count on your toes and fingers, and that's it.
Yep, so absolutely.
That's okay. I know I deliberately gave myself a buffer for this, or a very specific time thing. I hope the Ted Bundy episode enjoyed being the longest episode ever, for holding that title for roughly 2 weeks, because clearly this episode is going to usurp it. So folks, thank you for...
What? Oh, wait. What does this have to do with Dr. Sleep? Did we ever get to that?
Oh, Halloran, about the fact that somehow how they.
Oh, okay. That
reconcile
was
Halloran
all you had about it.
well,
Okay.
Well, F Dr. Sleep. Like, no, like I rewatched that trailer and I was getting angry. I'm like, no, like F this movie. Remember, folks, the sequel to The Shining is going to be Danny and little girl go to the Overlook to fight half vampire people and Jack Torrance Force Ghost. It's gonna be awful. Like it's one of those movies. Like we're not gonna, obviously, based on what we're recording next, we're not going to be talking about it the 31st. But it's something that maybe might be able to fit into the future, depending on how bad it is. if it is really a sight to behold in a bad way, there's a very real possibility that we'll get to it sooner rather than later.
Okay. Indeed.
All right, Rob, we are close. I think it's fair to say that we're going to have our second longest episode ever of Cinemodities.
Yes.
So with that being said, Rob, how are we going to conclude this week's episode?
So I think there's only thing that's left is to end this episode with some reversed music by Krzysztof Penderecki, who does a lot of the music, or has a lot of his music featured in The Shining. It's that great screeching chords and stuff like that. He's also featured in episode 8 of Twin Peaks: The Return. So let's get some of that really cacophonous Holocaust-inspired music in reverse.
None of that womp, womp, womp. None of that?
Maybe to end it out, because I always like to tail out the reverse stuff, because if you just take something and put it in reverse, it usually just gets crazy and it like ramps up and then ends. So I can blend some of that together, to make it, tail off.
Oh, okay.
So, I try to make it peter out, because I know our fans, they don't come here for me, they don't come here for you, they come here for reversed music.
There you go. That's right on the money.